My grandpa was born just under 100 years ago back in 1927 when Canton was still a major stop at the Mississippi Central Railroad. He and his family lived on a little plot just off the square where they could hear those trains rolling day and night. My great-grandpa Job made money loading and unloading railroad wagons, and it made him a good living for a while. But then the Depression hit, and from about 1929 onwards, things got worse and worse for folks around Madison County. Great-grandpa Job used to get odd jobs fixing the tracks when he could, but the railroad company didn't need him at the roadhouse every day like they used to, and he was out of work for months at a time. My great-grandpa took to washing and ironing for $1 or $2 a load from the better-off families in town, while us kids, me and my 2 sisters, helped tend a garden of okra, green beans, corn, and tomatoes. Supper was mostly cornbread and whatever stew meat they could afford, and sometimes money got so tight that they'd water down condensed milk for the little ones and mashed up leftover greens and water to make a kind of grassy soup, which everyone hated. There was a food program in town, and folks lined up for hours to get their hands on things like meal, grits, salt pork, or cheese, and Grandpa said if it wasn't for those, some folks would have straight up starved. Grandpa said he remembered how summers used to be fun, but by 1936, they were all about chores. He and his sisters used to chop cotton, pick berries, or help neighbors around their home for a nickel or 2 apiece. At least the neighbors who hadn't already moved over to Jackson to seek better opportunities. People started leaving, the town started dying, and it might have even snuffed out the town altogether if it wasn't for the silver linings that World War II brought. It probably sounds pretty dark, but the worst war in human history made a lot of folks a lot of money. Not least the fighting-age men around Madison County who were itching to get back at the Japanese with Uncle Sam lining their pockets. The railroads were busier than ever, and for a while my grandpa got to work shifts with his dad, loading and unloading railroad cars down at the roadhouse. And it seemed like things were finally starting to look up. But right as they were, some really sinister stuff started happening around town. It started when a whole bunch of German prisoners of war got moved into a place called Camp Clinton just south of town. Grandpa said that there were about 3,000 POWs in total, and he'd sometimes see them working farms or resurfacing roads while under armed guard. People whispered about them, said they were dangerous, and that if they ever broke out somehow, that they might descend on Canton and wreak murder. And I guess people were just scared is all, because there was never any mass breakout attempt down at the camp. But 2 soldiers did manage to escape, and when they did, there was major panic. There were American soldiers searching all over the country, and Grandpa said he remembered them driving around Canton at night, driving jeeps with searchlights attached to the backs instead of machine guns. They searched section by section, eliminating areas and closing in on the escapees until there was only one place they hadn't searched: the swamps out near the Pearl River, just north of the reservoir. Grandpa said it really spooked folks around town because despite the fact that there was no other place the POWs could possibly be, a thorough search of the whole damn swamp didn't turn up a single trace of either escaped prisoner. Soldiers were heard saying how it was like the 2 Germans had disappeared without a trace, and that they might have gotten themselves eaten by gators after wading through the wrong patch of water at night. But that wasn't the only thing that had people around Canton spooked. Some of the guards from Camp Clinton used to head into Canton to buy cigarettes or candy, or to sink a few beers at one of the bars when they were off duty. Now one night, a couple of soldiers were in a bar around closing time when they started telling the bartender about something they saw out in the swamp. They were out doing some kind of nighttime search for the 2 Germans, trying to catch them on the move when they thought it was safe to do so. And then as they'd been paddling up and down in the dark, keeping their eyes and ears peeled for any sign of escapees, one of them saw something which turned their blood to ice. 3 ghostly spirits seemed to hover on a nearby bank for a moment, causing one of the soldiers to gasp. He pointed them out to his fellow soldiers, but by the time they'd shown their big searchlight on them, the group of pale figures had disappeared. Apparently, the soldier's 2 friends believed his imagination had just gotten the better of him, and they poked fun at him for being such a scaredy cat. But the soldier was adamant that he hadn't imagined anything, and I guess the bartender must have emphasized that in his retelling because rumors started going around town that the swamps were haunted. Grandpa said that at first, and embarrassingly enough, he believed the rumors to be true. He was 15, but while he was old enough to work and take care of things around the house, his imagination was still ripe enough for a story like that to take root. After all, those POWs were two hardened veterans of the Africa Corps. They'd survived war, so the chances that they'd fallen victim to nothing but some swampland seemed very unlikely, and even if they were dead, there'd be some piece of them left behind to prove it, even if they were only the parts that the gators wouldn't eat. And so if those two veterans had just disappeared, what other explanation could there be, if not some kind of terrifying supernatural one? Folks started warning their kids to stay away from the swamps, and even some grown adults stayed away from the area at night, but not everyone did. An older kid named George Jackson, who Grandpa said was around 17 at the time, told everyone that he was going to head into the swamps at night to find out if the ghost rumors were true. His buddies begged him not to go, but George, who claimed that he was an expert in all things related to the spirit world, said that there was nothing that they could do to hurt him and how they were merely spectral apparitions of dearly departed souls. He said that he might see his old grandpa out there, wandering among the cypress trees, and there was nothing anyone could do to talk him out of it. And so off he went, into the swamps under the cover of darkness. And he was never seen again. Yet another search party was sent out into the swamps, only this time it was made up of deputies and volunteers. They searched high and low for young George Jackson, and they even dredged the swamp in places that they were able to in hopes of bringing up his body. But no matter how hard they searched, not a single trace of the boy was found anywhere. Now naturally, the whole Madison County was freaked out by the second sudden disappearance, because while two POWs not being found at least made sense to them, having George Jackson vanish like he did meant something really bad must have been happening out there in that swamp. And some folks said the escaped Germans were to blame, how they'd probably murdered young George after he happened across their little hiding place. And others said that it must have been those ghosts spotted by the soldiers, and how George must have discovered that they weren't so harmless after all. But then to their shock, it wasn't even a week later that a gator trapper made a horrifying discovery while skinning and gutting his prey, because inside the animal's stomach were human remains. Folks kind of assumed it was poor George in there, and so there was a strange sense of relief when scraps of clothing found in the animal's stomach were determined to have come from a German military uniform. And people believed George might still be out there lost in the swamps and would find his way out again any day now. But sadly that wasn't to be, and George wasn't the last one to go missing before everything came to a head. About a week after the German POW's body was found by that gator trapper, a man was driving through the area at night when he stopped his car at the side of the road that ran parallel to the swamps. No one knew for sure why he stopped, whether it was for a bathroom break or to check his tires or something. All they knew is that he didn't get back into the driver's seat and his car was found, idle but still running, by a highway patrol cop the next morning. There was a brief search of the area, with sheriff's deputies patrolling the water's edge with their shotguns in hand, but none strayed too deep into the swamps, not even during daylight hours, because by then there was no doubt. A very dark and dangerous affliction had befallen Madison County's cypress swamps, and no one wanted to be its next victim. But unfortunately for one person, they found themselves in the very unenviable position of being just that, the next potential victim. Waylon Jones was in his 20s at the time, and thanks to a medical condition, had been rejected from joining the military and serving overseas. He made money by helping out women whose menfolk had gone over to fight in Europe or the Pacific, but it seems old Waylon's mama forgot to impart a very valuable lesson to him, and that was not to touch what didn't belong to him. It turns out Waylon was having an affair with a taken woman, and a very risky one at that, because if the woman's husband found out what's going on, either personally or via a letter, then he'd no doubt enlist his family, his cousins, and his cousins' cousins in skinning old Waylon raw before using whatever was left as gator bait. Waylon's lover lived over in Sand Hill, and he'd go visit her after dark. He'd stay until late enough so no one would see him returning and start asking questions. But this one night, Wayland noticed a whole bunch of soldiers guarding the bridge across the reservoir. But not just soldiers either. There were deputies too, and almost every deputy over at the department was either a friend or an acquaintance of his lover's husband. Wayland knew that he couldn't cross the bridge and that he'd have to find another way to get back to Canton that didn't involve walking for miles at a time along dark and dusty roads. And so he decided to wade through the swamps up near the Pearl River. Wayland knew well that the folks had been disappearing out there and that wading through the swamps at night was very risky. But if he crossed that bridge and those deputies figured out that he'd be staying late at the lovely Mrs. Garrity's place, he was going to wish that he was dead before they were finished with him. And so, he chose the swamps instead. Wayland said he'd never been so frightened in all of his life, knowing that he might just run into whatever evil was inhabiting the swamps face to face. He moved quickly and as quietly as possible, making sure to give any gators a nice wide berth, and then about halfway through, he started hearing this voice carrying through the trees. Wayland said at first it was nothing but a whisper, and he figured it might just be a gator hissing off in the distance. But then he heard it again, and that time, it was clear as crystal. Someone off among the trees was saying, "Help me." Wayland said he froze on the spot, knowing that he should run, but also knowing that he wouldn't be able to live with himself if he did. He didn't have any scruples about lying with another man's wife, but apparently he wasn't all bad, because instead of just running off and making sure his own skin was saved, he went creeping off into the direction of that voice, the one saying, "Help me, anybody, please," over and over. Wayland said he crept forward with nothing but the moonlight to guide him, when he suddenly saw a figure right next to a tree, standing on top of what appeared to be some kind of rickety old chair. The man was naked as the day he was born, and even in the moonlight, Wayland could see how badly the man had been beaten, and possibly even tortured too. He said his body looked like a road map of cuts and purple bruises, and that his face was so swollen that at first it was impossible to recognize him. But then as he got close, Wayland realized who it was. It was young George Jackson. But when Wayland asked what the hell had happened to him, all George said was, "I'm sorry," just as Wayland noticed the rope around his neck. Suddenly, a leg flew out from behind a tree, kicking away the chair the naked George was standing on before the air was filled by the sound of the poor boy choking to death. And before Wayland had a chance to cut him down with the knife that he was carrying, he was set upon by a trio of white, ghostly figures who maintained absolute silence as they tried to wrestle him to the ground. Wayland was beaten and strangled as his attackers tried to pin him to the ground, and he realized that they were not trying to kill him. Not yet, anyway. Instead, they wanted him alive. He later said that they believed that they caught him unawares, but Wayland was already holding his knife when they attacked, and so no sooner had they laid hands on him, but Wayland started swinging the blade wildly, slashing and stabbing at all three attackers. They were evidently unprepared for such violent resistance, as Wayland managed to best two of the men before the third one ran off into the swamps, still bleeding from the cuts Wayland had given him. But the thing that really gives me the creeps, and that gave my grandpa the creeps upon hearing this story, was how those three attackers didn't make a single sound, even when Wayland drove his knife into one of their chests. And that's all besides what those three men look like, which is something else which has given me the willies, even since the day that I heard the story told. Much like the so-called spirits that soldier thought that he saw out in the swamps while he was looking for those German POWs, the bodies of the men who attacked Wayland appeared a bright white. It turns out that before they'd go hunting for people out there, they'd strip down to their drawers and paint their bodies with paste made out of water and white chalk. But neither Wayland or anyone else around town, including the sheriff, could figure out why those monsters stayed quiet the whole time. I call them monsters only because my grandpa used that word, but he made it clear that they earned that nickname through their actions alone and not entirely their appearances. They were just men, flesh and blood like you and me, but since nobody claimed them as kin or even claimed to have seen either man before in their lives, nobody figured out who they were or where they're from. It was like they just appeared in those swamps with the sole purpose of capturing, torturing, and killing folks in the worst ways imaginable. As you can imagine, the whole Madison County was in conniptions over Wayland's story, not least because a bunch of deputies were able to head out into the swamps, find those chalk-painted bodies, and confirm his story was true. Some folks said that they must have been the German POWs because who else would go about murdering people like that and doing such strange things and painting themselves white? It sure explained why no one recognized them too. But officially, Camp Clinton would admit to no other escapees and insisted the murderers could not have been German captives. But if that really was true, then who the hell were those murderous animals out there? All kinds of rumors went around among my grandpa and his friends, how these men were really monsters or children of the swamp and other such nonsense like that, and he said it made it all the worse by the lack of any kind of official story. Now this was way back during the war, so the Office of Censorship was in full effect. They'd already sent letters around to every newspaper in the country advising them to keep their stories positive or face closure. And this meant the editor of the Madison County Herald didn't dare print the story of what happened out in those swamps or the stories of the folks who went missing. And that meant that no one really knew what happened out there for many years, till the Office of Censorship closed at the end of the war, and people were able to piece together what had happened, my grandpa included. Grandpa ended up moving away from Mississippi to seek his fortune elsewhere. But as long as he lived, he never forgot the story of poor George Jackson, those German POWs, and the ghostly figures who made the swamps their human hunting grounds. My name's Lucy, and I'm a listener from the UK, and this isn't strictly my own story, but it's one that deserves to be told, and by the time you've finished reading, I'm confident that you'll agree with me. One Sunday morning, back in November of 2021, a friend of my dad's got up for work. David had worked as a cabbie for many years, so he knew the job as well as anyone, and he knew better than to work late on a Saturday night and risk someone puking in his taxi or trying to do a runner. And so instead, he used to skip the late weekends and work the mornings, which were much less rowdy and only slightly less busy. And that Sunday in particular was bound to be a good earner because it wasn't just any old Sunday, it was Remembrance Sunday. Remembrance Sunday in the UK is basically like Veterans Day in the US, a day to remember our war dead and pay our respects to them. Now, a lot of people choose to stop and stand still at 11 a.m., the same time that the guns fell silent in World War I, and have a minute's silence. And a lot of people get together at places like cathedrals or army places to lay wreaths and say prayers and stuff like that. Now, people sometimes have a drink after the services too. Nothing too wild, just a pint or two with old mates in memory of the fallen. But that means people needed taxis, so it was an ideal time for Dave to hop in his cab and go looking for fares. Now, from about 10 o'clock onwards, David started getting jobs ferrying people around the city to various church services. But he also got jobs taking one or two groups to the cathedral, which is where this big Remembrance Day ceremony was being held, probably the biggest one in the city too. Some of the people were wearing bits of old military uniform like berets and stuff, where they were obviously veterans of old wars or off to pay tribute to their old pals. And so Dave's having this little chat with them, asking where they served and when and all of that, and then, at what must have been about 10:45, he gets a job taking someone else to the cathedral, presumably for the service. He pulls up outside a house not far from the city center, and a guy gets in the back carrying a large, heavy-filled backpack. He tells Dave that he wants to go to the cathedral, so off they go. As they're driving, Dave asks the man in the back if he's attending the Remembrance Day service. He says yes. They make a bit more small talk, and along the way somewhere, Dave runs into a bit of traffic. It turns out there's road work ahead of him, so half the road is closed off and traffic's been brought to a near standstill as everything's been reduced to one lane. Dave realizes they're going to be stuck there for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, And then he looks at his clock and realizes if they stay there, the man in the back is going to be late for the service. Dave turns to his passenger and says something like, I think you're cutting it a bit late here, mate. I'd just get out and walk if I were you so you don't miss the service. Now, the guy is obviously a bit annoyed, but he doesn't get angry with Dave or anything because I imagine that he knew he'd mucked up by not calling the cab earlier. Dave even said that he wouldn't charge him for how far they'd gone because it hardly seemed fair if it was him who got them stuck in traffic. And this was his first clue that something wasn't quite right because the fella didn't so much as bat an eyelid at the prospect of a free lift. Normally, people either say, "Oh, no, that's not necessary," or at the very least, "Well, thanks a lot, that's so kind." But this fella didn't offer so much as a single word of thanks and instead started looking around as if trying to figure out where he was. Dave later said that he thought the guy was just annoyed about being late for the service because he looked and sounded kind of foreign and might not have known how to get there. And so as he's looking around as if scoping out a route, Dave starts explaining how all he has to do is walk straight down the road in front of him and he can't miss the cathedral because it's so big that he'll see it if he just keeps walking. Now, you'd think the bloke would be very interested in that information, considering that he's about to be late for this thing. But apparently the same thing happened as when Dave mentioned the free ride. The guy in the back didn't seem remotely interested and just kept on looking through the windows like he was scoping the place out. Now, after about a minute of this, Dave notices the guy looking over at this huge complex of blue-gray buildings which stood on the other side of the dual carriageway. He asked Dave what it is, and when he told him it was the women's hospital, Dave listened in total confusion as the guy basically said, "Okay, drop me off there instead." Dave told him he was better jumping out of the car right there, but the guy insisted on being dropped off in front of the hospital so he could walk from there. Now, he suddenly didn't seem all that fussed about making it to the ceremony on time. He seemed more concerned with the fact that there was a maternity hospital right there next to him. And I think it was about then when Dave realized the man in the back of his cab was up to something. He didn't know if it was drugs, cheating, or something more sinister, but whenever a passenger is funny about where they're going and what they're doing, it's usually because they're up to no good, obviously. But what did a fella with a big, heavy backpack want to be dropped outside the woman's hospital for? And as he asked himself that question, I think it dawned on Dave what a bad position he was in. He didn't make a fuss or start asking questions, but what he did do was lock his cab's doors, meaning when they stopped, the fella wouldn't be able to get out without giving an actual good reason why he'd changed his destination. If he showed him what was in the bag, he'd let him out. If he didn't, well, that was a different story. Dave waits his turn to go and then turns around and takes the road into the women's hospital car park. Now, he must have been sweating buckets, and somehow he kept his cool. And then when they stopped outside the front doors, the man in the back didn't even try to pay. And this is a private hire cab that wasn't an Uber where you either pay cash or pay by card, and by the end of the ride, it doesn't automatically come out of your account or however that works on Uber. Now, most people, when they're not doing runners, pull out their wallet or some cash as they come to the stop. This fella just grabbed his bag and reached for the door handle before they'd even come to a stop yet. But when he realized the car was locked and Dave wasn't going to let him out, he reached into his bag and detonated the bomb that was in there. The explosion blew all the windows out and sent all the bits of metal the bomb contained out with it. Now, you can watch the CCTV footage of the blast on the internet, so maybe go watch it instead of me trying to describe it. But my point is, it doesn't look like there's any way in hell that either David or his passenger could have survived it. Everything inside looked like it had been blown to pieces, but somehow, I suppose by some kind of miracle with it being a Sunday, one of the cab's front doors opens just a smidge, and Dave the taxi driver comes stumbling out, probably with his head banging and ears ringing. Now, he's obviously had the life frightened out of him because he tries to almost run away from the scene at first. But then a fella in a high-vis jacket goes running over to him to help, and Dave stops trying to run. He's got his hand on the back of his head the whole time, I suppose because it was burned, but also because he was checking to see if the back of his head hadn't been blown off. It hadn't, thankfully, and if you can believe it, I don't even think Dave even spent a single night in the hospital. I think the only fairly serious wounds that he got was that bit of his ear was cut off by a piece of metal from the bomb. That and his hearing's been quite seriously affected by how loud the explosion was. On the other hand, the passenger in the back seat was blown to bits. And although someone tried to drag him out of the car thinking the whole thing had been some kind of accident, the whole car was soon on fire with flames licking out the windows and his body being burned along with the car. Finding out was horrible. My dad knew it was Dave before it was officially named because he recognized Dave's car from some of the first images released. But to find out who the bomber was, we had to wait, and it was a very confusing process. First of all, we heard his name was Enzo Almeni. But then it was announced that he changed his name while living in the UK and that his real name was Imad al-Swilmin. We were then told that he was a refugee from Syria, but then that was quickly corrected when someone found out that he was Jordanian, and that he might have been trying to cheat the asylum system by claiming that he was from Syria, which had a war going on at the time. Everyone was obviously thinking, this guy's a terrorist, nothing else to it. But then there was a weird twist to everything. Firstly, Imad had been sectioned not long after arriving in the UK, after walking around town waving a knife and shouting at people. And for the folks who don't know what sectioned means, it's when someone is detained under the Mental Health Act, not arrested as such, but detained for their own safety. He spent some time in a unit, took some medications probably, and then when he gets out, Imad decides that he wants to convert to Christianity. Apparently he got involved with the Church of England, saying that he wanted to settle into his new home by taking the local religion and changing his name. And then when we found out which church it was literally chilling because it wasn't a church. The place Imad had been planning on attacking was the very same place he'd been going to undergo his conversion. And as you can imagine, everyone found it outrageous, but it was all a massive headache for everyone too, because who was this fella? Was he like an actual terrorist or just a mental case? And then from what I can tell, it was a case of him not being a terrorist and then suddenly was a terrorist. I think he would have done or said just about anything to stay in the United Kingdom, to the point some people think that he faked that mental breakdown with a knife so they wouldn't be able to deport him because of all that human rights stuff. It definitely looked like he faked his conversion, or that he at least changed his mind about it, because he stopped going to the cathedral a few months after he was finally confirmed as a Christian. Apparently he'd been baptized 2 years before, but the priests or vicars or whoever wanted to make sure that he was for real. And they had him coming back for years before they finally confirmed him. But it seems that might have been nothing more than an attempt to trick the immigration services because, like I said, he stopped visiting not long after. And I heard that 2 days before the attack, Imad called his brother in America and told him he was planning on doing something bad, quote unquote, as he put it. And that proves the whole thing was planned ahead. And then when the police searched his flat, they found evidence that he'd been building the bomb for months before the attack was ready to go. And the fact that he chose to attack on a Sunday, and Remembrance Sunday too, has a scary sort of significance to it considering all the conversion stuff. And then we found out that after his flat was searched, police found a prayer mat and a Quran and all of that, so he obviously switched back to Islam before he tried to go through with his plan. Now, I just wanted to say that some of my best mates in school growing up were Muslims, and the fella in the shop around the corner from us is from Yemen, and he's one of the nicest guys you could hope to meet. And so this isn't me trying to bash anyone by telling the story, as I know they're not all like that, and I know not all asylum seekers are out to take advantage of a system meant to help people. But we gotta be more careful, because psychos like Imad are out there willing to do and say anything to try and cheat that system, and when they don't get their own way, they're finally told no, and that they're going to be deported. They're going to lash out and try to hit people where it hurts the most. And like in Imad's case, when he saw a maternity hospital with newborn babies and decided it was the perfect place to take a bomb. My name's Annie, I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but for the last 20 years or so, I've been working as a wetlands ecologist down here in Florida's Big Cypress National Preserve. And after I got my degree in environmental science up at UPenn, I moved down to Florida to do a master's on, and this is putting it as simply as possible, how water levels mess with cypress domes. And then after a few years filling out wetland permits and monitoring on behalf of state agencies and consultants, I spotted an NPS job on the USA Jobs website. Government research jobs are always uber competitive, mainly because you get paid to do the thing that you're super into all day, but that doesn't stop anyone from throwing their hat into the ring, myself included. And with my fieldwork experience giving me an edge, I managed to land a permanent spot at Big Cypress. My work involves a lot of staring at spreadsheets and liaising with state agencies, but I get to do a fair amount of fieldwork too, which has always been my favorite. Sometimes I'm out there tracking water levels or hunting and mapping invasives like the Brazilian pepper. And then sometimes I help plan prescribed burns to keep the pine woods healthy, or I'll do counts on wading birds or alligators, trying to figure out if the canal plugging and rehydration projects are actually working and aren't just a waste of time and money. It's hard, sweaty work, and the bugs are by far the worst part. But keeping this wild piece of land healthy makes it worth all the blood, sweat, and tears, even when things get dark out there. And this is the story of the darkest, most disturbing incidents of my entire career. Whenever we're doing field work out in the deep swamps, we rely on airboats to get around, and at the time, mine was a 14-foot aluminum flat bottom powered by a big old aircraft engine with one of those big propeller cages on the back. You probably know the thing. It was loud as hell, but that kept the gators away from the boat, and since it could get you places a more traditional boat couldn't, it was much more preferable to paddling out in a canoe, especially for stuff like collecting mud samples. I used to head out first thing in the morning when the waters were still calm, and then after picking out a sampling site, I'd head out with what we call ponars, which are these small hinged boxes that are probably better described as grabbers. You lower it down from the bottom, let it sink into the muck, and then a few days later when it's nice and full, you gently pull it back up to capture that soupy bottom layer without too much disturbance. It's all about being careful so you don't stir up the water and skew the data. But half the time you're either wrestling with tangled vegetation beneath the surface or, in this case, something else. I was out in the swamps one morning and it was so early that the sun was only just starting to peek up. I was out retrieving the kind of mud samples I just described, which are nice and easy to find thanks to the little floaters attached to them, which bob above the water surface. I'm heading from site to site on my boat, carefully hauling them up and then moving on to the next. The water was still, the bugs weren't bothering me as much, and the only sounds out there were the occasional bird call or gator splash, and so everything else felt nice and peaceful. Collecting those grabbers was going well too, at least until I got to my fourth, which I felt a snag as soon as I tugged on it. It wasn't unusual for a cord to get caught on a root or cypress knee, and I had a pretty foolproof technique of giving the cord a little slack so I could untangle it. But on this occasion, even after plenty of slack and swaying, the cord still wouldn't budge. I leaned over the side and looked down into the murky water. I'm not sure why, I sure as heck couldn't see anything. I guess I was just wondering what had gotten it so stuck. I gave the cord another couple of wiggles, but as I'm doing it, I was thinking, it can't be a cypress knee. It couldn't have been any roots either because I was too far out from the banks. But still I wiggled the line, hoping that the sample wouldn't spill, until suddenly it came loose with a kind of popping sensation. I breathed a sigh of relief and then began gently pulling the grabber up to the surface. I pulled and I pulled, expecting to see the box appear at any moment, but something bigger appeared first and floated right to the surface in front of me. And when I realized what it was, I flew back into the boat so hard that I'd probably have capsized it if it were a canoe. I thought it might have been a dead deer or hog or something at first, but to my horror, and on closer inspection, I saw that it was no animal. It was a human. It was extremely bloated, rotten to the point of being a bluish-greenish color, and missing its legs below the knee. But even with all that decay, I could tell from its size that the corpse had belonged to a child of approximately 6 to 8 years old. Thanks to the gators, fishes, and turtles that had been eating away at it, the damage and decay were so extensive that I couldn't tell if it was a little boy or a little girl. And the skin looked like it was sliding off in places, and in others, what remained of its flesh was so infested with bugs that it literally looked like it was moving. The face was half caved in, with empty eye sockets looking back at me, and dark tufts of mud-slick hair on what little was left of its scalp. It was festering and covered in slime and mud, and the smell. Jesus Christ. It was like it hit me in the face with this wall of sour rot, tinged with swamp gas and death. I tried to stop myself, but it was no good, and I ended up puking my breakfast over at the other side of the boat. And then, even after I managed to catch my breath and somewhat got myself together, I was still in a really bad way. I should have called it right there, but I'd never seen a dead body before, let alone one belonging to a child. And so I guess I kind of lost my mind for a minute or two, because all I wanted to do was to get the hell away from that body no matter what. I drove the boat back to the dock, tied her up, and then walked straight to my car and drove home still in shock. And it was only once that I'd taken my second shower to try and get the stink off of me that I realized that it was all in my head, and I burst into tears. And by that I mean the smell was all in my head. Like I thought that I could still smell the rot, but it was just kind of the trauma talking, if that makes sense, or almost an echo of it or something. Once I pulled myself together, I toweled off and called the cops to let them know what I'd found. I was able to give the exact location too, because I dropped the grabber's cord and left the floater at the surface again, so it wouldn't be hard for them to find. A deputy I spoke to said to expect a phone call, and then the next day I got one. I ended up driving over to Everglades City to this missing persons detective, who turned out to be this no-nonsense kind of guy who grilled me on all the details. He asked if I remembered any scraps of clothing, jewelry, or distinctive marks that they could use to ID the kid, but nothing stuck out to me. All I could remember was that rotten, stinking, bluish-green flesh, and the god-awful smell that seemed like it was burned into my brain. And me and the detective kept in touch for a little while. I was so torn up about the poor kid that he said that I could call to get updates from him, and I hoped that it might solve some kind of long-dead case and that the poor kid's family could finally get some closure. But when I finally did get some news, it wasn't good. The level of decomposition was so advanced that there was no recovering any usable DNA. There was also no missing kid reports that matched the area or the timeline, so the kid was eventually buried as a John/Jane Doe, and the case went cold. I've been devastated. All the nightmares I had, being constantly distracted by the memories of it, I thought that it might all be worth it to put an end to some horrible chapter in a family's life. But for it all to be for nothing, and for that poor kid to remain nameless, it just tore me up inside. Even though, all these years later, I remember that poor kid sometimes when I'm out sampling, wondering what the hell happened. Was there some kind of accident, or was the poor kid murdered? And what of their family? I bet they'd have given just about anything to know what happened to their child, even if it was such a terrible ending to such a short life. My name's Pete, and since I'm from down under, I thought that I might give you the old traditional greeting there. G'day. Now, I'm retired these days, living out the rest of my days in peace here in my native New South Wales, and while I've done a lot of different things during my working life, I spent the final 6 years of it driving cabs around the bush. Life out here in rural Australia got its own sort of rhythm to it, though. It's a lot of farmland, so the days start nice and early, and I'm out picking up people from their farms or little towns scattered across the bush. The roads are mostly dirt tracks or long stretches of highway with nothing but gum trees and kangaroos for company. They're alright in the day, but at night, you gotta watch out for them because they'll jump out into the road and scare the living daylights out of you. Now, it's nice and quiet though, really quiet in fact, and there are never any jams, only ever the odd tractor holding you up and those that you can just pass. But that means we charge much less for much longer journeys, considering a simple run to the shop could be 25 Ks each way. Fuel prices are a killer, same with the heat in the summer and the fog in the winter that makes driving legitimately dangerous. But there's a real sense of freedom and community that I wouldn't give up for anything. Everyone knows everyone, so chats in the cab are sometimes like catching up with old friends. Lots of runs are locals headed to town for groceries, doctor appointments, or to visit family. You'll get the occasional farmer who's banned for drink driving as well, so every so often you'll get a stretch of picking up a Ned in an Akubra and work boots who's off to the sale yards or to pick up some supplies. And then once his ban is all served up, he says his goodbyes, but you stay mates. And then there are the older people who don't drive anymore, and I'll take them to bingo or the pub for a yarn. Tourists pop up now and then, wanting a lift to the national parks or the wineries, and back to the airport once they're all done and dusted. It's all pretty laid back. You end up hearing some ripper stories along the way, and you end up getting to know pretty much everyone as you go about your travels. But that means when you pick up someone new, it's almost like a special occasion. You don't go being nosy and all of that and start prying into their personal lives, but there's definitely an element of, well, who's this guy then? And it was no different the time that I got a job picking a fare up from a pub late at night, and a pub that I was very familiar with and I'd never seen him before. This guy's wearing a black hoodie, dark jeans, and work boots, and he's come staggering out of the pub, and right off I'm assuming that it's someone that I know who's had a skinful. I'm smiling to myself thinking, who's this clown? But when he gets in the cab, I realize that, like I said, he's a total stranger. Now I start dialing it back, right? Because I'm about to start joking around and saying, what are you thinking, you bloody dickhead? The wife's gonna have your balls for earrings. You just look at the state of ya. But then I can't say that to a total stranger now, can I? So I dial it back, wish him a good evening, mate, and all of that, and then ask him where he's off to. Now, the guy says he's headed to his mate's house, and he sounds pretty sauced when he tells me he's not 100% sure where it is. But if I take him to this one particular road about 20 minutes drive away, he'll be able to direct me from there. It turns out he wasn't from around there, which is why he didn't know the area very well. But that wasn't a problem at all, and I promised that I'd get him where he was going, even if it did require a little bit of teamwork. He didn't seem all that talkative, but that was fine by me. Not everyone fancies a chat. But I did have to convince him to take his hood down so I could actually see his face. It was dark out, and he had this hood right up over his head so I couldn't make out his face, and I joked that he was making me nervous, and he did take his hood down, but he didn't laugh or really anything. Now, he was just deadpan, with his dark hair and eyes, and he also looked like not that much older than a kid, to the point where if I had to guess, I'd have said that he couldn't have been a day older than maybe 22. He was just a kid, so while he was acting a bit weird and moody, I wasn't scared or anything, not at all. Anyway, we got to the road that he wanted me to drive him to, this really long one with houses on either side, spaced out, mind you, and one that led deep into the bush. Now we're driving down and I'm slowing at each house asking him, this one? But each time he shakes his head and asks me to drive further down the road. Now I thought it was pretty funny at first, thinking that this guy had been so smashed when he'd been to his mates and that he genuinely couldn't remember where it was. But then after going past maybe 5 or 6 different houses over the course of about half a mile, like I said, spaced out, I asked him if he was sure that this was the road that he was after. Now, he just mumbled something about how we needed to keep going, and then after I think 3 or 4 more houses, we stopped seeing any and it was just bushland on either side of the road for maybe another half a mile. Now this was after he told me to keep going and how his mate's house must have been at the end of it. Now I knew we couldn't find anything because I knew the road, but the customers always boss here, as they say, so I drove him all the way down till there was nothing but trees in front of us to show him how that there was nothing there. I told him, well, there you go, mate, nothing there. Should we turn around or we just headed off-road? But all he did was mutter something about me switching off the car. I asked him to repeat himself and he said that he wanted me to switch the engine off so we could talk. Now, I'm not adverse to a little heart-to-heart with a passenger. I mean, we're like mobile bartenders like that in a way, listening to people's problems, suggesting solutions, or just being the proverbial shoulder to cry on. But this guy was making me nervous. Call it a hunch, or just call it that I'm not keen on stinking drunk strangers, but I was a lot more wary than I'd normally have been if someone asked me to turn off the engine. But I did as he asked all the same, and then with just a hint of nervousness, I asked him what he wanted to talk about. Now I turned around in my seat a bit so I could see him and saw a youngish guy with dark hair and dark squinty eyes who seemed very nervous about what he was going to say. I let him take his time and then tried to prompt him based off of his body language by saying, "You've been having some dark thoughts, have you, mate?" Now he nodded, and I thought that I had it right on the money, but I didn't. I was slightly but crucially off. He told me that he'd been thinking about hurting people. Not himself, but others, and that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get all those dark thoughts out of his head. He felt angrier and angrier at the world with each passing day, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he hurt someone. And the longer he waited, the worse it got, to the point that he couldn't stop thinking about what it'd be like to kill someone. And that was my chance to get a word in, because I had a thing or two to say about what it meant to take a life. I told him it was something that he didn't want to know, and while he thought that he did because of how angry he was, he actually didn't know what he was asking for. I told him the dead come back to haunt those who take their lives, that ghosts are real, just not in the traditional floaty white sheet sort of way. I told him all that from the heart, from experience, but he didn't seem like he was listening, or rather, he just didn't agree. He told me that he'd heard all that stuff, all the old cliches, how it feels wrong in a way that can't be put into words, and he believed it too. It just hadn't changed his mind. He still wanted to cut someone up, feel how warm their blood is coming freshly out of their veins, and he wanted to watch the life drain from someone's eyes too, knowing that he was the one to do it. I told him he didn't know what he was talking about, that life wasn't a movie and that killing was a chaotic, messy, and terrible thing. And I'll never ever forget how when I said that last part about chaotic, terrible, and messy, that little bugger smiled. He kept a smile as he told me that that's what appealed to him, that he'd been thinking about it for so long that he couldn't take it anymore. He told me he had to kill someone, and that night was the night he was going to do it. Now there was this moment of quiet, him smiling and looking at me under his brow, and me just staring back at him thinking, this prick's gonna try and bump me off, isn't he? After giving me some little speech that he'd probably written in his mom's basement. Now I think he saw it in my face too, that he'd said too much, and I knew what he was planning, so he went for me. He pulled a knife from his hoodie and then leaned forward between the two front seats and started slashing and stabbing at me with it. But his swings were wild, and with me leaning forward in my seat to reach under it, he only had an arm and my hip to stab at rather than my head and neck. I still wasn't safe though, not yet. But that kid couldn't have a single bloody clue who he was getting into that cab with. Not a single clue. Because he only got about 3 decent jabs into me before I pulled something up from under the seat, stuck it under my arm so the barrel was looking right at him, and then bang, bang, bang. It was all over. Now this was way back before Port Arthur and all the buyback stuff, so I was able to keep a handgun under my seat for anyone who tried to rob me, or in that case, worse. I'd also done 2 tours of East Timor in my 20s, when the fighting was at its worst too, so when I say I know what killing a man is like from first-hand experience, I'm not kidding. Killing a man in war, it's not a natural thing. People say it is, but it isn't. If it was, it wouldn't follow you around like a bad smell for the rest of your life, and you wouldn't think about the people you killed so often. If they had families, what they did before the war, and what they might have been doing after. A good man doesn't want to kill. He has to, and he spends the rest of his life wondering if he really had to do it, or if things might have been different, if this or that had or hadn't happened. But the lad in the back seat, he wasn't a good man. Or he wasn't even really a man, just a kid. But you know what I mean. He was a bad seed, born with the devil in him, as the old Nana used to say, and there was nothing else I could do but put him down like some dog. Now, I was hurt pretty bad, But I also knew that I needed the crime scene left exactly as is, so I ended up running to the first house that I could find and banging on the door. The people inside thought nothing of helping me out, stopping the bleeding and calling the police, and an ambulance showed up not long after, and I had to drive to the hospital to get stitches while the police took a look at the scene after I'd told them the whole story. It was a pretty open and shut case on their end. The kid still had a knife in his hand, leaning forward, and he'd been slashing so wildly that some of my seat was just completely shredded. Now, that wasn't even the only knife that he had on him either. He had another, a smaller one in the pocket of his jeans, and then an even smaller one jammed into the side of one of his boots. It was clear who the aggressor was, no doubt about it. And so there was no arrest, no court, nothing like that, just fair dinkum cobber and on you go. And now, that silly little bastard is just another one of the ghosts that follow me around, making me wonder why the bloody hell I didn't take that Friday night off. My great-grandma Velda grew up in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, and let me tell you, she lived one hell of a life. She was born in 1901, a week after the August hurricane, and her mother called her a miracle baby and said the only reason God saw fit for her survival was to give birth to the most beautiful baby that had ever been born, save for Jesus, of course. And when she was 4, she survived the yellow fever epidemic that killed hundreds, if not thousands of people. And once again, her mama called her a miracle baby because the fever didn't take any of her family. Naturally, Grandma Velma had no memory of all that, but she did remember the Grand Isle and New Orleans hurricanes that hit when she was 8 and 14 respectively. And then came World War I and the Spanish flu, which killed almost 3,500 people in New Orleans alone. She survived the floods, the droughts, the depression, and lived through a whole bunch more wars, and she had plenty of good stories to tell. But perhaps the most memorable she ever told me was one from Prohibition times, when moonshiners and bootlegging rackets were all over the Louisiana coast. Back then, life was really hard for people in the belly of the bayou. Early mornings meant 5 a.m. in the summertime, 6 a.m. in winter, with cockerel cries and yells of Allen's boo from Cajun mothers. Folks were poor too, really poor, so Grandma Velda used to go out on pirogues with her older brother, trapping muskrat or hauling in redfish and speckled trout while their daddy was at work. Now, folks mightn't have had much money, but they still wanted to party, so there was a rich tradition of brewing up homemade wine or straight-up moonshine so people could have something to drink while they danced and fiddled till dawn. But then, Prohibition hit, and when the moonshiners moved their operations out into the bayou, the Bureau of Prohibition followed them, and then what followed was a bloody game of cat and mouse. The chief of police tried to keep his boys out of what was turning into a bloody battle of attrition between the Bureau and the bootleggers, but that could only last so long. One night, one of the parish police officers came stumbling through the door, having been shot through the gut by a bootlegger he'd been unlucky enough to stop. The officer hadn't even been looking for bootleg liquor. He just wanted to make sure that the driver wasn't drunk since he was driving so late. But since the bootleggers were in their total war mentality after fighting the Bureau so intensely, the man just reached for his pistol, shot the officer through the stomach, and then drove off. The man's fellow officers tried rushing him to the hospital up in New Orleans, and word has it he's alive and talking when they got him there. But sadly, he lost way too much blood during surgery and he passed away on the operating table. The chief and his boys were furious. They didn't agree with Prohibition, not just because they respected the tradition of home brewing, but because they enjoyed a drink or two themselves. And this meant at first it was their unofficial policy not to enforce it. But after one of their officers were killed, that all changed. The chief of police, a man named Henry Herbert, knew that the key to beating the bootleggers was winning the parish's trust. Not that the people didn't trust him to enforce the law, they just didn't trust that he could keep them safe from men who rode by night to seek retribution against those that had wronged them. See, the bootleggers owned the night. and they ruled by fear and mistrust. Everyone knew that anyone working with the Bureau would end up having some kind of accident, or in more serious cases, have their brains blown out while they slept to send a message. But no one knew exactly who was in the bootleggers' pay and who wasn't. See, it wasn't just a hardcore group of old Cajuns hiding out in the bayou. They had friends and relatives looking out for them, as well as paid lookouts who only wanted to make a few bucks. And that meant that there were never any tips, never any sightings or witnesses, and why the bootleggers were always one step ahead of the law somehow. But this led Chief Herbert to do something pretty radical. He approached the New Orleans Temperance League, a very well-funded group which promoted sobriety, and asked them to sponsor a reward system for anyone who helped bring the bootleggers to justice. Unsurprisingly, the League was only too happy to help, meaning Chief Herbert was able to ride up and down Plaquemines Parish, announcing rewards for anyone who approached his officers with information. And at first, they got nothing but a handful of bogus reports intended to throw them off. But then one of the parish officers approached the chief, talking about a girl down in Potash who wanted to talk to him about the bootleggers. He said it was real important, and what she had to say involved one of the lead bootleggers having an after-hours sit-down meeting with a wealthy New Orleans financier in the saloon she worked at. There was just one condition. She would only talk if they gave her a ride up to Belle Chasse in the middle of the night, after guaranteeing the safety of both her and her family. Chief Herbert gave the officer the go-ahead to drive down to Potash in the middle of the night and deliver the girl to safety. But that very same night, when the officer arrived at the girl's home, they found her mama in a state, talking about how she hadn't come home that evening. She wasn't missing for long, the poor thing. She showed up the next morning when a fisherman up near the town of Empire spotted her body floating in the Mississippi. And the whole parish was as horrified as it was furious, but they didn't need to ask Chief Herbert to do anything about it, because he already had a plan. He was going to head out into the bayou with a handful of his officers, find the first bootleg liquors still they could, and then blow it up to smithereens with some dynamite that they brought along with them. And if there were any bootleggers unlucky enough to be around at the time, they were going to face Chief Herbert's wrath. The chief waited a couple of nights, long enough for the bootleggers to start feeling safe again. And then he gathered up half a dozen of his officers, armed with rifles and shotguns as well as their sidearms, and then led them out into the swamps under the cover of darkness. The chief knew the area well, and the men he'd picked to join him were all accomplished outdoorsmen. They crept through the bayou on cat's paw, slowly getting deeper and deeper until they couldn't see lights from the parish townships anymore. They stayed quiet as mice, avoiding patches of mud and water while never once daring to shine a light or talk louder than a whisper. And then after maybe an hour or two more, they smelled wood smoke and realized that they were close. Chief Herbert and his boys kept on moving till they found a moonshiner's shack, and then they slowly closed in till they had it surrounded. Then on the chief's signal, they rushed the shine shack with their weapons at the ready, only to find it empty. There was a fire burning under the still, and even a whole bunch of mash in there slowly brewing up, but there were no moonshiners. At least, none that the chief and his boys could see, because the next thing they knew, they themselves were surrounded and caught in a bootlegger ambush. One of the officers went down right away when a bullet almost took his arm off. Then another took a bullet when he tried to return fire and win the officers a little slack. If they didn't fight their way out of there, if they didn't do something, they were all going to die, and Chief Herbert knew it. He grabbed one of his wounded men's sidearms, then carrying a pistol in each hand, he ordered his men to all open fire at once to give him enough free air to slip away. And the plan worked like a charm, and the chief was able to slip out of the ambush site without any of the bootleggers realizing he'd moved. The chief could have just as easily escaped and left his men to die, but he never was the type of man to hide a yellow streak on his belly. And when the chief circled around on foot, moving as fast as he could, the bootleggers did not expect anyone to be behind them. They were too busy and far too excited in shooting at the shine shack and trying to kill police officers. Some of them were executed point blank without even turning around to see who was killing them. The chief killed one bunch and then ran on to the next, taking each group from the rear so they didn't even know what was hitting them. And then slowly but surely, as the ambushers were put down, till the rest realized the game was up and they fled into the darkness of the bayou. Once reunited with his boys, Chief Herbert ordered one to escort both wounded men back to the parish, and then after that, he and his 3 remaining officers ran roughshod through the bayou, blowing up shine shacks and shooting down bootleggers like they were a bunch of wild Indian braves. They'd stayed out there for a whole nother night too, running on pure adrenaline and their love of justice. And then, when all was said and done, the chief could boast that 11 shine shacks had been blown to bits. Upon his return to Belchase, the chief told his wife to take their young daughter and go find some place to hide out in New Orleans. The bootleggers, or at least what was left of them, would no doubt seek their revenge against the chief and his men, and he didn't want his kinsfolk around town when they did. He put them in a car and covered them with blankets too, so folks couldn't see what or who was being transported. And then after that, he went and got himself a few hours of sleep before he and his boys went back out in the bayou to do it all over again. And the story has it that the chief and his officers went back out near the site of the ambush when they spotted 2 bodies floating in the water nearby. One of the officers figured that it might be 2 of the bootleggers that they put down 2 nights ago, but they didn't have any flashlights on them to confirm it, so they got up way too close instead. That's when one of the officers says in a voice that sounded thick with horror, "Oh my God, don't look, Chief. Don't look." But it was too late. The chief had already recognized the bodies of the woman and child floating in the water, for they belonged to his wife and his daughter. Folks say that the chief went mad with grief right then and there. His wife and kid had been dead and floating for hours out there, so there was no bringing them back. But that sure didn't stop the chief from trying. He pulled them out of the bayou and then tried clearing their lungs and breathing air into them. But when he started pushing on their chests to clear out the water, it wasn't water that came out of their mouths. What came out had this kind of chemical tinge to it, in a way half-stagnant bayou water could never be. Because the chief's wife and daughter hadn't drowned. They were already dead when they were tossed into the water. What came out of their mouths that night was moonshine. Someone had murdered them and then filled their lungs with bootleg liquor. Once he was sure they were dead and there was no bringing them back, Chief Herbert supposedly went very quiet. His boys kept asking him what they should do, but he didn't say a word in response. The chief wasn't even fighting back tears, he was just quiet, like the loss had completely broken him. And then with his wife over one shoulder and his daughter over the other, he walked off into the bayou, never to be seen again. No one ever saw him out there, but folks knew that the chief was out in the bayou still hunting down bootleggers. You'd see the smoke trails in the morning rising up from the thicker parts of the swamp, and you'd know that he'd been busy. They'd find the bodies too, bodies of bootleggers that had been tortured to death. They'd be missing their scalps, their noses, and sometimes their whole jaws had been ripped out. But that last part had a practical purpose, because breaking their jaws or chopping and ripping them out entirely made it much easier for Chief Herbert to fill the lungs of the dying with the same moonshine they filled the lungs of his wife and daughter with. The killing and burning continued for a few weeks, and all the while, people would be heading out into the bayou trying to find him and bring him home. But old Chief Herbert was never found, and the only thing folks would find was the evidence of his blood-soaked work. My great-grandma Velda knew that story like the back of her hand because she'd heard it told and retold dozens of times by the man that she'd later marry. His name was Jacob, and he was one of the men shot during the ambush Chief Herbert saved them from, and he went on to become my great-grandfather. Sadly, I never got to meet him, and I only met my great-grandma Velda when I was just a baby, so I don't have any solid memories of any times we spent together. But just knowing their story and the story of Chief Herbert's righteous revenge is enough for me to feel connected to them. And it's through knowing our kin and our history that we get to know ourselves better. Driving for Uber in London was probably the lowest point of my entire life. It sounds harsh, and I'm not saying that there weren't upsides to it or that I didn't meet some unforgettable people while driving them around. It's more that I was forced into it after my first business went under, so I was in a really bad place mentally. And it was while driving Uber that I went through what might have been the scariest experience of my entire life. London is a mad city. Probably always has been that way and probably always will. I like being able to pick my own hours and log on to Uber whenever I fancied making a bit of cash. I could choose to only work peak hours too, because surging fares meant that I could make double or even triple what I might make during quieter periods. You meet all kinds of people too. Tourists, interesting locals, even celebrities sometimes. And if you're out chasing airport runs, you can make a tidy amount of money on chilled out runs while chatting about people's holidays, visits to family, whatever it is they're traveling for. You're your own governor, really. Just you, your motor, and the app. But it's not all sunshine and roses. London traffic can be an absolute nightmare. Half the time you're stuck in gridlock, burning through your petrol and your patience, especially when ULEZ charges nick a chunk of your earnings. Insurance rates are liable to go through the roof, and you gotta shell out for PHV license and checks, and if your car's playing up, then even more money down the drain. Competition is horrifically fierce too, and there's very little honor among drivers in that respect. And so sometimes you have to be extra quick on the draw to get a decent fare, or you could be waiting there for almost an hour trying to get on the scoreboard. And I'd say the very worst part of the job is the passengers. The bad ones, I mean. I'm not talking about the ones who complain or chat nonstop when I'm trying to concentrate on the road. I'm more talking about, in fact, well, let me just tell you the story and you'll see what I mean. So about a month before I threw in the towel and signed up to Universal Credit for a bit, I got this job taking some lads from Brixton down toward the Kingston Estates. They were quite a rowdy little trio who kept me waiting a few minutes before they piled into the back of my car. They couldn't have been older than maybe 25, but you can't tell with some of them. I've known a 17-year-old lad to look and talk like a bleeding 30-year-old, but that's neither here nor there, I suppose. Now anyways, these younger lads pile into the back making jokes and being loud, but they weren't being threatening or intimidating or anything like that, just young and annoying. I confirmed where they were going, told them to fasten their seatbelts, always a good idea with young lads, otherwise they just don't, and then off we went towards the estates. The other thing that really annoyed me about that job was how they somehow picked rush hour of all times to request their Uber. You obviously get big fares from driving people around at those times, but it's so not worth it compared to late nights or even early mornings when everyone's rushing but tired. But sometimes when you're out, you're out. So it was better to take the job and be stuck in traffic making money rather than losing money. And so as expected, we hit a traffic jam pretty quickly and slowed to a stop surrounded by cars. The lads in the back are complaining, trying to backseat drive and all of that, and I wasn't a bell end to them or anything, but I said that they weren't getting charged any extra and they should just relax instead of giving it all that. Now they were chill, saying, "All right, mate, fair enough, we're good." And then we sat there for a few minutes, moving forward by a few cars every so often while we waited for our turn at the lights. The lads in the back were chatting away to themselves, and it sounded like they were looking out the window and pointing out at a passerby. Now they said, "Is that so-and-so?" And another said, "Yeah, it is." And then the first lad then said, "He's seen us. He's coming over." And this is when I turned around to see who was approaching the car, because the lad in the back sounded pretty nervous, like whoever it was didn't want to give him a very cheery hello. But when I turned in my seat and looked out the back window over my left shoulder, I just thought, bollocks. Because approaching my car was a lad on a bike, wearing a black ski mask and what looked like he was holding a freaking sword. Now I say sword, but it was more like a designer machete, if that makes sense. At least 1.5 feet long with a jet black blade, and it looked quite expensive actually, like a good bit of kit if you were off on a jungle trekking holiday. But this wasn't the Amazon. This was London, so as soon as I saw it, I knew something bad was about to happen. Now the first thing I did was lock my doors, and then the lads in the back started shouting, "Drive, drive, drive," but there was nowhere I could go. I kept telling them that I'd locked the doors and that the guy couldn't get him, but as he got closer and closer to the car, I realized a window wasn't going to stop him. The guy got off his bike in gridlock traffic and started bashing my back window with the handle of the machete. I realized very quickly that they'd be trapped once that glass fell through, and that the guy on the opposite side needed to get out of the car and make room so the others could get out. I unlocked the door because there was a child lock in the back and then started shouting at the guy in the back to get out and run. I shouted at him again and again to get out of the car, but it was like he was frozen. His eyes were glued to the window as the machete hammered on it until it suddenly smashed. The glass burst and flew into the car. It was only then that the guy in the back realized that he actually had to get out so his mates could actually escape too. But by then, it was a bit too late for the lad nearest to the machete. I don't know how many times he got stabbed before I finally just put my foot down and reversed into the car behind me. We hit bumper to bumper, and I thought that the lad in the back might make a run for it just like his mates had by then. But all he could do was clutch at all of his stab wounds trying to stop the bleeding. That and shout, "Please drive, please drive, please drive," over and over at me. Now everyone could see what was happening, and the cars on my right pretty much saved this lad's life by hanging back and giving me enough space to get out. And I suppose they didn't want their cars smashed because it was the only route that I had available, so if they clogged it up, they were going to need some work done. But they left it free all the same, and I was able to peel out of the gap at speed before taking it to a grass verge and overtaking all the waiting traffic. Now we're finally away from the guy with the ski mask and the machete, but it was still the matter of getting the lad in the back to the hospital. And even that wasn't the first thing on my mind. He was back there shouting, "Please, bruv, please take me to hospital. I don't want to die. Please don't let me die." And this other stuff that was sending my blood pressure through the bleeding roof. And I thank God that I knew the road so well by then too, because if they'd have been at the beginning of my stint driving Uber, I think I might have not actually known where to take him. But luckily, I was able to zoom him over to the nearest A&E where he was rushed inside and obviously made a priority patient because of all the stab wounds. I ended up staying in A&E for about an hour, waiting to hear back from a doctor that the lad was at least okay. Now obviously, I had to stay there to talk to the police as well because that's where they were coming to talk to the guy who'd been stabbed, but I really couldn't tell them all that much aside from where it had happened and what time. They thanked me and then waited around for a bit chatting until the doctor came out with the good news. The lad was going to be okay and he was awake and able to talk and all of that, and so the police were free to go and talk to him. I was able to go through too just to be able to wish him all the best. I didn't stay long, I couldn't, but the level of gratitude he showed me from the hospital bed was something I'll never forget. I wasn't the one who saved his life. I was one of many people who contributed to saving it, but the way he thanked me for saving my life, it makes me quite emotional to think about it today. He kept thanking me even as I walked off with a lump in my throat and I had to properly pull myself together when I went back outside. I couldn't take my cab because the police wanted it for forensics, so I had to call a cab of my own for once to get home and tell my girlfriend everything that had happened. I got my car back in a couple of days, which was nice, and I was never so glad to have paid for that big insurance policy prior to working for Uber because it meant I got hazardous materials covered by the plan and didn't have to pay a thing to have it cleaned. I wasn't even going to take out such an expensive plan at first because it really is like insane rates at the minute to get private hire cabs covered in London. But the two pieces of advice I got from another driver were, 1, when in doubt, cancel the fare, and 2, upgrade your insurance because people are nasty and leave all sorts of mess in your car. I thought I could avoid it by picking my fares carefully, and I still took his advice and upgraded my plan. And oh my God, was I glad I did, because it saved me so much of a headache I can't even imagine. I didn't last much longer after that. I wasn't traumatized or anything, I just knew that I should pack it all in before my luck really ran out, if you know what I mean. And I started a second business earlier than planned and then worked 70-hour weeks for just shy of 2 months until it started to break even. And after that, it was onwards and upwards in a weird way, and it was like something good came out of something bad because being so determined to stay off the roads and make something of myself was what I needed to make a success of myself. Hey, let's read. Big fan. I think I got a fishing story of mine that you might enjoy. And I know fishing ain't exactly the scariest of subjects outright, but I promise you, this one's got some bite to it. Many years ago, my friend, this old pal Earl, went out fishing in the Great Dismal Swamp out here in North Kakalaki. Now, for those that don't know, the Great Dismal is basically a huge stretch of murky water along with these cypress trees, Spanish moss, and humidity that's so thick it feels like the air is weighing on you. It's a really beautiful place when the weather's fine, but it's wild too, and while that definitely helps give it an almost creepy sort of vibe, it sure is a fine place to catch some fish, I'll tell you. Now, it was September, and one of those overcast, drizzly days that's perfect for fishing. And so we figured that we'd head out with our John boat, our rods, and a cooler full of bait to see what we could bring home. Now, I had some night crawlers and some stink bait that I whipped up myself. Then, of course, we brought along a six-pack or two of them cheap beers to make the hours slip past a little quicker. And to us, there was nothing better than sitting out there, lines in the water, waiting for a bite while we talked out all of our problems and just watched the world go by. And so we went out whenever we could, especially when the weather was right for it, and that day was no different. We pushed off from the bank around 9:30, motor chugging away as quiet as we could to make it so that we didn't spook away all the fish. And someday when the weather's nice, the Great Dismal can be a real pretty place. But on days like that one, where there was nothing but light rain and gray clouds overhead, you can bet your ass it earned its name. It gets so dismal that it for real gets a little creepy at times, especially when it's all quiet and there's nothing but the sound of bayou bugs buzzing near your ear while they try to drink your blood. We both used a ton of bug spray, and that mostly did the trick in keeping them off you. It's creepy as hell knowing that there are little vampires flying around, but having so many around means you're in prime catfish territory. Because when the rains come down and the bugs start hitting the water, it's feeding time. And since we'd grown up together, Earl and I had been fishing together since we were small, and so we knew all the spots. We anchored up in this little cove where the water was still deep, and then started casting out our lines. We got a couple of small ones right off the bat, nothing to write home about, but enough to get us hungry for bigger and better fish. Things were going just fine till Earl was telling me about the time he hooked a bass as big as a hog over at Fontana Lake. And in the middle of the story, he made this big gesture to show me how he did something, and he knocked his beer off the edge of the boat and into the water. It hit the water and started sinking fast with the bubbles trailing up like they were mocking him. But then Earl, being the stubborn son of a gun that he is, wasn't about to let a perfectly good cold one go to waste. He whipped off his boots and socks, took his shorts off, and then hopped into the water. I think he figured the water would be no higher than his waist because in most places the swamp's nice and shallow, but we must have drifted off into a deeper spot because when he dropped, the water went all the way up to his chest. I'm laughing at first, saying that I hope that beer was worth getting soaked, and then as he's wading over to where the beer was, something knocked him off balance, and he let out a scream. The water near him starts churning up like a washing machine on spin cycle, and Earl's arms were flailing all wild before he yelled out, "Something's got me." My heart jumped into my throat because I'm thinking it was a gator maybe, or one of them big water snakes that lurks in the roots. I grabbed an oar, ready to whack at whatever it was, and leaned over the side ready to swing, but as I did, Earl came leaping towards me through the water with one of his hands reaching out towards me. I grabbed his hand and hauled him up onto the boat, and then he just kind of laid there gasping with his face red as a beet. He's drenched from head to toe, breathing heavy and letting loose a string of cuss words that'll make a sailor blush, and I asked him what the hell had gotten him, and he just shook his head like he didn't have a clue. Then we cranked the motor and peeled out of there faster than scalded dogs. Now once we were back on solid ground, safe and sound with the boat tied up, Earl rolled up his pant leg to check the damage. There was this big, ugly red scrape running across his calf, raw as hell but not bleeding too much. Those were no regular teeth marks either, not the ones that you might expect. They were rough, like somebody took a sheet of sandpaper and rubbed it hard across his skin a bunch of times. I know those kind of marks anywhere, because they come from a catfish bite and there ain't no mistaking it. But here's the kicker. The span of that bite went from knee to ankle on the back of his leg, meaning the catfish had to be pushing at least 12 feet long to make a mark that big. But that doesn't make a single lick of sense because there's no flathead or channel cat in those swamps that can get anywhere near that size. The record around here is maybe 5 or 6 feet on a good day. But that thing, it had to be a goddamned monster. And since swamp waters are full of all kinds of nasty bugs and bacteria, neither of us were about to take any chances with a wound like that. And so after getting Earl into the truck, we hauled ass over to a hospital. It was a real bumpy ride at first because we had to get off the back roads, and the whole time Earl was complaining about how his leg was throbbing like a bad tooth. And we got to the ER, checked in, and then the doc took a look at Earl's leg. He obviously didn't need any stitches, but it turned out his tetanus shots were way overdue. They jab him with a fresh one, and then while we're sitting at the sterile waiting room, Earl can't keep his mouth shut. He starts regaling the nurses and anybody who will listen with the whole story. Now the beer drop, the underwater tussle, and how we thought that it was a giant catfish that nearly made him miss supper. Now people started chuckling at first, thinking it's just another fish story. But then he started telling it back home too, and in a small town like ours, word gets around fast. And when it did, it was like we lit the fuse on some powder keg. And by that weekend, half the county was abuzz with talk of some legendary catfish hiding out in the Dismal. Fishermen from all over started flocking to the spot we described, and not just amateurs either. We spotted guys with fancy sonar and heavy-duty tackle, retired guys who had put all their time into fishing, and each and every one of them was clearly hoping it'd be them to reel the beast in. It turned into a full-blown fishing frenzy with coolers and beers and campfires on the banks. Local bait shops ended up selling out big hooks and line, and even local news picked up on it, saying it was the Dismal Monster Hunt. Now, Earl and I stayed clear, laughing about the chaos we started. But as the days dragged on and nobody hooked the thing, folks started turning skeptical. Whispers turned to accusations, with folks saying that we'd done nothing but tell a tall tale. And that hurt a bit, I can't lie, because we knew what we saw. Earl's bite mark healed up just fine, but that old catfish, he's probably still down there in the depths, growing bigger by the year. Those things can live 80 years easy, some say even longer, and so one day, mark my words, somebody's gonna cross paths with it again. But until then, Earl and I will just keep our story between friends, knowing the truth is out there, lurking quietly in the Great Dismal. As a younger man, I used to drive taxis around my home city of Belfast. But driving taxis in Belfast during the 80s was a lot different to driving taxis anywhere else. Because this was at the height of the Troubles during the 80s, meaning Belfast was a very, very violent place to live and work. You'd hear about bombings and shootings on the radio, sometimes on a daily basis, and it got horribly normal to be driving along, minding your own business, and suddenly come across a British Army patrol and their Saracens, all armed to the teeth and looking angry. It was a scary time, but you had no choice but to carry on bringing home the bacon because we all had people depending on us. Some came close to some pretty nasty ends while out on the roads. Fellow cab drivers, I mean, though. But some came closer than others, myself included. On a very drizzly Tuesday in 1981, I was out on the roads picking up fares. I've been on the road since tea time, having done a few runs into the city center and back. And then around 10 o'clock, I was cruising along the Falls Road edge on my way to Anderson Town to pick up a fare. Now, the drive took a little bit shorter than usual as I was mostly driving down empty back streets, and since I was starting to feel a bit tired, I remember telling myself that that was the last job for the night. And remembering that gives me a dark sort of chuckle these days. I got to the pickup spot, which was the car park of the old swimming pool before it all got done. But when I pulled in, there was no one to be seen anywhere. Now I'm thinking the fella's inside the building, that he's a member of staff who needs to set the alarm and lock up, so to save petrol, I turned off my engine while I waited for him. 1 minute goes by, then 2, then 3, and still no one appears from the pool building. I started getting a little bit impatient, thinking that I'll just give him a few more minutes good grace and then I'm off ski. I remember tapping my wheel, looking out my driver's window at a car that got my attention, and that's when the shooting started. The window screen shattered, glass was flying everywhere, and then one by one I started feeling the hits. First in the shoulder, like a hammer smashing bone, and then the chest, knocking the wind out of me. I got another in the leg, and that one was the worst, and it felt like someone had shoved a red-hot poker right to the bone. And the car was getting riddled. The panels were buckling, the tires were popping, and all the while I'm trying to make myself as small as possible, practically ducked down into the footwell trying to climb inside the engine. And it was only when it stopped that I started thinking, why me? What did I do? I was just driving a taxi trying to make an honest wage. Who the hell did they think I was? And the pain was everywhere. And somehow I was still conscious and gasping for air, because the shooting had stopped and I was still alive, and I thought that maybe I'd gotten off easy. I knew I still had a mountain to climb in terms of getting myself help, because I could feel everywhere that I'd been shot, and I knew that I had to get to a hospital. But there was also this mad feeling of relief knowing that I was over the worst of it, and it was all technically uphill from there. Unfortunately for me, that wasn't exactly true, and as I tried scrambling back into the driver's seat, I heard the footsteps on the concrete outside. I looked up just in time to see a man in a balaclava pointing a pistol through the window, and it wasn't quite like my life flashed in front of my eyes, but I did quite clearly see an image in my mind of my wife and kid at home, crying when they got the news. The gunman leans in a bit more, so he's pointing this gun right at my head with the barrel inches from me. I remember his eyes, how they were a lighter shade of either blue or green, and I remember how much hatred was in them. I've never seen anyone so angry at me in all of my life, not before and not since. And this monster didn't even know me. At least I'm 90% sure he didn't, and to him, I was just another Protestant. He had no hesitation whatsoever in pulling that trigger, but when he did, nothing. The gun had jammed. Now, it was a miracle or a complete coincidence, depending on how you look at it, but again, it wasn't over. The guy starts fumbling with the gun, trying to make it shoot. I saw a bullet pop out when he did something like slap it or pull at it, and then he tried again, aiming his gun toward my head and pulling the trigger. But again, the gun didn't fire. I was laying there, sort of leaning against the seat, watching it all like it was in slow motion as he tried once again to make his gun work. Blood's pooling up under me, my vision is blurring, and I remember listening to him muttering to himself, just properly desperate to get it working so he can blow my brains out up close. He didn't get a chance though, because one of his mates suddenly appears and grabs his arm, and then he shouted, "Leave it!" and both of them ran off. They knew the RUC would be on the way, the police I mean, and while it must have been only a minute or so before I heard their sirens, I'm sure you understand when I say that it felt like an eternity. The last thing I remember was blue flashing lights, and then just this big blank space between that and waking up in a hospital bed with machines beeping and nurses fussing over me. The doctor said I was very lucky and that the bullets only missed all my vital bits by a matter of millimeters in some places, but I'd lost a lot of blood, and my shoulder was shattered and needed pins, and my leg was fractured. But the worst part was the chest wound. It had collapsed the lungs, so I needed a tube put in to drain all the fluid. And seeing all that and feeling it too was probably the worst experience of my whole life. Worse than the shooting, because that was over in a matter of seconds. Whereas that tube was in there for over a week, and I still feel weird phantom pains looking at the scar where it went in. I was in the hospital for weeks, having all sorts of operations and then doing all the physiotherapy that came afterwards. I had the wife and the little one in there crying over me, which was really tough, and my little boy didn't understand what was happening at all, so it was even worse on him just not getting any of it. The peelers came around too, that's the police if you're wondering, asking me all kinds of questions that I didn't know the answers to. I didn't see any faces, I couldn't ID anyone, and I could barely even remember driving out to the old pool. The whole thing was just some blur. My time in hospital was basically one big blur too, as I had morphine for the pain, anti-anxiety too, because I kept having these nightmares at first whenever I'd nod off. Visitors brought grapes and cards from the church, and then my cousin, who was a very religious person, rest her soul, brought a minister in one day to pray over me. and he said that the gun jamming was divine intervention, but I'm really not so sure. I think it was just dumb luck. Recovery took months, but eventually I came home on crutches and with my arm in a sling. The neighbors turned out like a guard of honor to welcome me home, all queued up to shake my good hand and tell me that they were glad to see me home. They brought me food over so my missus didn't have to cook, and she spent all that extra time on her hands either crying or telling me that she was going to divorce me if I didn't stop driving the taxis. She wasn't serious, I don't think, or maybe she was, who knows, but I did as she asked me all the same. I found work packing boxes in a warehouse, which was very boring but much safer, but there were still signs of what you might call PTSD today, but back then it was just stress. I'd jump at cars backfiring or doors slamming too loud, and then forget about cabbying or driving anywhere at all for that matter. I didn't get behind the wheel for a while, even when I was well enough to do it. And as you can imagine, it reminded me too much of that night. Even just holding the steering wheel in the same way I did when I was waiting caused cold sweat to collect around my neck and armpits. And then my heart would start hammering like I was about to have a heart attack, and I'd end up crawling out of the driver's seat, hyperventilating until the wife came out to bring me inside again. My mind was locked onto the shooting for months, and any spare moment I had, my mind would wander to it. I'd think about the rat bag who lured me to that car park and wondered if he was forced to do it, or he did it willingly because he was so full of hate and anger, like the same sort of wild hatred I saw in the eyes of the man who tried shooting me in the head. As far as I know, he was never caught, but even if he was, he'd probably be a free man today after the Good Friday Agreement let all kinds of thugs and killers back onto the streets. I was told that writing this out would be healthy for me, and in a way I suppose it had been, but sometimes thinking about the coincidences is enough to drive me insane. A good example would be how many things had to happen for that bastard's gun to jam twice on him. He had to buy it or get it from a guy that hardly cleaned it, and then the ammunition that he used had probably been kept in a damp place or something to try and hide it from the peelers. And so much had to happen, or not happen, for my brains to stay in my skull that night. And although I'm not a strictly religious man, it is hard not to wonder if there was some sort of higher power at work that night. A long time ago, almost 20 years in fact, a female friend set me up on a blind date with a guy named Ryan. He was a buddy of her boyfriend's, one he spoke very highly of, and for reference, I was a 28-year-old woman when we met, while he was almost a whole 10 years older at 37. My friend promised me that he was good looking and that he had a good job, all that jazz. And while I hated the idea of a blind date and how it made me feel so incapable, I didn't regret going. Ryan was a truly beautiful man, but then once we got talking, I understood why he was single. First off, he sounded like a legit workaholic, and while he admitted that that was something he needed to work on, it leads me to the second thing, his poor communication skills. I called my girlfriend on my cell from the bathroom, and then she says, "Oh, he's just shy, let him warm up a little." And at the time, I thought that she was right. I was patient with him, told him he didn't have to worry about offending me or upsetting me. I mean, not within reason anyway. And then over the next month or two, Ryan really opened up to me. He didn't become some social butterfly overnight or anything. He was always kind of soft-spoken and reserved, but what I found out about him, I liked. He was super into ancient history, and I'm Greek on my mom's side, so I thought that was really cool. And then he was super into cooking too, which was really attractive for all the obvious reasons. But the thing, or rather place, that Ryan seemed to have the most passion for was the Philippines. And when I visited his place, I saw all kinds of photos, souvenirs, and traditional Filipino artwork. I asked him why he was so interested in the Philippines, and he said he'd vacationed there a bunch as a child as well as an adult of his own volition. His grandpa served there during World War II, so he'd brought Ryan's dad over a bunch to see how beautiful it was. And from the pictures, it was clearly one of the prettiest places on Earth. There were pictures of Ryan standing on white sandy beaches in the company of various people, and then photos of him out in the jungle that he said were from nature tours. All the food looked amazing, the people all sounded super friendly and welcoming, and I totally understood why Ryan and his family had such a huge love of the place. The relationship went from strength to strength. I met his parents, he met mine, and we went on a wonderful weekend vacation together in Mexico around the 8-month mark. Now everything was going amazingly. And then just short of our 1-year anniversary, Ryan asked if I wanted to move in with him. I wasn't 100% sure at first because I've never lived with a boyfriend before and figured that was something couples only did after maybe 2 or 3 years of dating. But since I did really like him and he was everything I was looking for in a long-term partner in terms of cleanliness and having his crap together, I accepted and then moved in the following month. We spent our 1-year anniversary together in our apartment, and I know I keep saying this, but at the time, I was very, very happy. Ryan and I seemed like a really good fit for each other, and all of my girlfriends kept asking, when's he going to pop the question? I think if things had continued for maybe another year or two without incident, I'd have accepted any proposal he offered me. But, and as I guess you've already figured out from the way I'm talking about Ryan, things didn't stay all hunky-dory, and it wasn't long before things got really, really dark. Okay, so remember when I said Ryan was a workaholic? Well, he never really got a handle on that. He worked in the city at some financial firm, running accounts or whatever the hell they do in those kinds of jobs, and I understood why he took it so seriously and why he worked so hard. And then at the risk of sounding shallow, he wasn't shy about spending money on me, so I tried my best to make it up to him in various ways. And one of those ways was cleaning the apartment. Ryan really appreciated me keeping our place looking nice, and we didn't have much in the way of boundaries either, so there was only one place that he didn't want to mess with, and that was this one particular cabinet in the closet that he kept in his office. It wasn't some super sinister thing, with him getting all weird and telling me not to dare go prying around or whatever. He didn't even bring it up. It was me after I saw all the delicate little trinkets that he had in there. The first time I cleaned his office, when I opened the top left-hand cabinet on this big old mirrored closet type thing, I saw it was full of little wooden figures. They'd been carved to look like man and wife, wearing traditional clothing and holding traditional weaponry, and the carving was so intricate and fine that I was scared to break them. I asked him if he was cool with me not cleaning that part of the closet since I didn't want to break anything, and then when he said that was fine, I just moved on to other stuff. Now this happened maybe 6 or 7 times more, I can't remember exactly, as I'd given the apartment a deep clean about once every 2 weeks. And then one day, I opened up the little cabinet thing that houses those figures and found it pretty damn dusty. Those little figures, all coupled up like they were, looked kind of sad covered in so much dust. But still, I didn't want to risk breaking them, so instead of cleaning them off, I decided to just take them out of the little cabinet very carefully and give the inside of the cabinet a clean instead. And so at the very least, they had a nice place to live, even if Ryan was neglecting them directly. Now I got the little footstool out of the bathroom and then took it into his office so I could get better access to the cabinet, which was just about arm's reach without it. I then took each set of figures, pair by pair, and set them carefully down on his desk before getting back on the footstool to dust the cabinet. I pushed the duster inside, and I was trying to get it all the way to the back when I suddenly felt the tip of the duster tapping against the rear wall. It felt pretty solid, so I figured that it wouldn't do any harm to really get in there, you know, because I couldn't exactly scratch the wood with a duster, now could I? But when I did start trying to dust all the way to the back, I suddenly felt the rear of the wall give way. Now obviously I'm freaking out, thinking I just broke my boyfriend's cabinet, which was an antique passed down from his Austrian grandmother too, I think. And so my first thought was to go get my computer chair, bring it into Ryan's office, and then stand on it so I could maybe reach into the cabinet all the way and fix the part of the cabinet I broke. But when I did, I shined a little flashlight into the cabinet to see exactly what I was working with. I realized that I hadn't broke the back of the cabinet at all. It was a false wall, and behind it, there was a little wooden box. And now here's where I kind of get an existential crisis, right there in Ryan's office. I knew he was hiding something from me. I mean, there was a chance that he didn't know that stuff was there, but considering it had those familiar sort of Filipino designs carved into it, I considered that a highly unlikely scenario. And so the only logical explanation was he was hiding something from me. And now I knew it could have been pictures of old girlfriends, maybe even nudie pictures, and while I do think holding on to stuff like that is kind of obviously in bad taste, I totally understood that he had a past, just like I did. But then, if it wasn't souvenirs from old conquests, then it had to either be drugs, weird adult images, or worse. And I wasn't going to risk that being the case and me not knowing about it. Not in a million years. I removed the box from its little hidey hole, then set it down on Ryan's desk, and then saw it had a little padlock keeping it closed. One that was small but very sturdy looking. I thought that was me out of luck, but just on a hunch, I checked the little hole for a key and, hey, presto, there was something shining at the back which fit the padlock. I took it off, opened up the box, and prepared myself to face whatever it was. But when I saw it, it was worse than anything I'd imagined. Far, far worse. When I first saw pictures of a grinning Ryan posing with naked children, you can imagine what my first thought was. I dropped the photo back inside, shut the box, and then found myself thinking, that's not what I saw, and you gotta make sure. Besides whatever kind of illegal activity was going on, it was going to the police in its photographic form, and so either way, I needed to open it up again and look inside. And so I did, and that's how I saw that they weren't being touched, or at least not in the photographs anyway. Because the kids Ryan was posing with and the photos I was 90% certain were taken in the Philippines were dead. And I'm not talking dead like died in a disaster or something and Ryan was documenting it for evidence or something. I'm talking like they showed obvious signs of being violently murdered in various different ways. There were heads missing, arms missing, legs missing, and some kids had been propped up to display huge holes in their chests or stomachs to show that they'd all been hollowed out. Some kids had what looked like wire around their necks, so tight there were bruises from it from where they'd been strangled to death. Others just had these big slashes across their throats and blood caked up their faces from where I think they'd been hung upside down and slaughtered like animals. And I say that because I've had a long time to think about what I saw. And there was one of Ryan smiling with this kid who had his little arms tied behind his back, but with just this ungodly amount of blood on his face, and I could never figure out why. Until much later, that is, when I realized that he'd probably been hung upside down before having his throat cut, just like they do with pigs over on farms. I saw it once I was on vacation, how the pig's head was drenched in blood and put two and two together before having sleepless nights with a lot of crying. I'm sorry for telling you all of this. I guess I got a little too emotional there and I decided to take a quick break. But now I'm back to writing and I don't want to write about those photographs anymore. I can't think about them without crying. And so if it's okay with a submission, I'm going to focus on what I did after I'd put one of the photos in a book. I didn't have an envelope handy and I drove straight to the nearest police precinct to show them what I'd found. As you can imagine, that made for quite a scene. But I couldn't bring myself to walk inside for almost a full 15 minutes because I had a full-on mental breakdown while sitting in the parking lot and wondering how the hell I could have been so stupid. Ryan was not who he made himself out to be, obviously. Or at least he had a deep, dark secret that he really didn't want people to know about. And at the time, I told myself that there must have been 1,000 clues along the way that I just didn't pick up on because I'm a total freaking idiot. I don't see it quite the same way these days, but I still regret not cleaning that mother effing cabinet out sooner. And I also regret not biding my time a little and then going to the cops the next morning while Ryan was at work. That way they could have actually arrested him and not showed up to an empty house with his suitcase and a bunch of clothes missing. I think I must have driven over to the police precinct at maybe 4:20 to 4:30 p.m., meaning I was still crying in the parking lot when Ryan arrived home a half an hour later and realized his little box of keepsakes had been found. And then by the time the cops showed up, he was gone. And they couldn't exactly track his car down because he'd left it right there in the driveway. I was questioned extensively on where he might have gone to hide out or where he might have fled the country to. My answer was the same to both if I had to put my money on it. I'd have bet on him being in the Philippines. 6 times a week and twice on Sundays, as they say. And they never did find him. The cops, I mean, and I heard they even linked up with the cops over in the Philippines to try and track this Ryan down. I don't know if they could connect him to any actual murders, but if those photos really were what they appeared to be, then there must have been rumors or something. Either way, Ryan was never found. At least to my knowledge he wasn't, and my best guess is he's living someplace far away. Maybe not even in the Philippines, but definitely under an assumed identity. So I'm a big horror buff, as you can probably imagine, since I'm a longtime subscriber of your channel. Love your stories, the scarier the better. And when I was a little kid, I used to persuade my babysitter to let me watch my parents' horror collection on VHS, or have her bring tapes over herself. I'd promise her that I wouldn't have nightmares, and I never did. I handled everything perfectly, except for one freaking movie. One movie that terrified the absolute living crap out of me and gave me nightmares for weeks. If any of you have seen it, you're gonna laugh your asses off. Ghoulies 2. I mean, I guess at least it wasn't Ghoulies Go to College, but still, Ghoulies 2 wasn't even freaking serious horror movie, really. It's a comedy horror, and not exactly the most celebrated of entries in the venerated Ghoulies franchise. Now, I won't explain the whole damn movie, but it involves a group of little critters, the Ghoulies, and one of them is a little bald green fish dude with sharp teeth. The movie takes place mostly at a fairground, and there's a scene where a clown is on one of those dunk tank attractions. You know, the kind where you throw balls at a target and knock the person into the water? In Ghoulies 2, the clown gets dunked and the fish ghoulie bites his arm off and then kills him. Now somehow in my stupid kid mind, this was what the dunk tank at a fairground was supposed to be. Some kind of device where the person getting dunked was at least under threat of being murdered. And I guess I thought that the tank usually had piranhas or sharks or something in it. God knows, really. Now, I was about 6 when this happened. I was horrified and completely mortified to discover that my dad, who was the town sheriff deputy, was going to be up on the duck tank at the local fair. Now, I couldn't tell why I was so horrified. I asked him why he'd risk his life like that, but he didn't seem to understand what I was saying, and I was too scared of getting busted for watching Ghoulies 2, so I guess I couldn't really explain myself very well. I wasn't the most logical or eloquent kid. Now the night of the fair comes and I'm absolutely crapping my pants at the idea of my dad being dropped into the tank of piranhas or sharks or ghoulies. And I kept crying that night until Mom threatened to ban me from the fair, and I knew that I had to attend just in case that there was something I could do to save my father. Now, watching with horror as they filled the tank and he climbed up onto the seat. The tank was about 8 feet high, so neither I nor anyone else could really see the monsters that I was certain lurked within. Now, I got this genius idea that every time someone would take a throw, I'd cough or sneeze or make some kind of noise to disrupt their aim. Now, this actually seemed to work, or maybe some people in my town were just terrible shots, or they were just too afraid to dunk the sheriff's deputy. And the whole thing was just ridiculous. Dad was dressed up like a sheriff clown. He had this Stetson hat on and this huge ruff around his neck that meant that he couldn't really do anything but look forward. And the whole point of being the dunk tank clown is you're supposed to goad the missile throwers into hitting you. Every time Dad chided them on, I remember saying no and doing my best to disrupt their aim. In the end, a local guy realized what I was doing and joked with my dad that his kid was trying to save him from his fate. Now somehow I got it into my head that this meant that everyone, including my father, knew that it'd be the death of him if he fell into that water. Why would he even agree to it? I was baffled. I had no idea what to do, so I crept around the back of the tank looking for a solution. Now, sneaking through the bushes, I saw 3 teenagers. I knew that they were trouble. They had a reputation as bullies, and even my older sister, who was their age, didn't always keep the best of company, had also told me that these guys were bad news. I watched them from the bushes for a bit and I realized that they were piercing the tank with what looked like knives and allowing it to drain into the large drainage ditch that ran along the edge of the trees lining the carnival. One of them said something like, "This will put a stop to that monster." And in my head, I was thinking, finally, someone else who knows. And these guys know about the ghoulie and they're going to help my dad out. And then one of the teens turned and saw me. He started to look angry, but immediately I assured him that I wouldn't tell and that they were doing a good thing. I think I even thanked them, and this made them laugh a lot and continue hacking away at the back of the tank, letting the water flow out even faster. Now remember, the tank was around 8 feet high, so nobody playing the carnival game could see the water level lowering, and I didn't realize this at the time, but the rough Dad was wearing as a part of his clown costume prevented him from looking properly downward, and thus also noticing the dropping water level. Now the teens told me to keep quiet, and I said, "Don't worry, you've saved my father." And they looked at each other very confused like. I didn't understand at the time, but I ran back around the front to witness what? I'm not really sure. A few more players later and someone finally hit the target and the seat collapsed under my father, and I guess I expected him to land in the bottom of the pool like some kind of ninja, safe in the knowledge that the ghoulie or shark or whatever had been swept out into the ditch. And instead, Dad disappears from sight into the pool, and the next thing I hear is the loudest, most horrific cracking sound, and then a scream that should have woken the dead. People were running up the poolside ladder, trying to climb in and see what had happened. I was jumping, trying to get enough traction in my tiny frame to apparently clear an 8-foot wall, and all I could think was that the ghoulie had gotten him after all, and that we'd been unsuccessful in our attempts at saving him. Of course, what had really happened is that Dad had fallen around 10 feet into a pool that was no longer having water in it. Being completely unaware it no longer had water at the bottom, he wasn't even able to brace himself for the fall. He just landed straight onto his legs, shattering one ankle and breaking the fibula of his other leg. Now eventually, after much chaos and screaming and crying and frantic action and paramedics, I realized that I had screwed up big time. Now, my dad wasn't a strict dad, the opposite in fact, and that's maybe why I felt even worse that I just stood by and let these teenage delinquents basically try to murder my dad. In my defense, and theirs, I really don't think they intended to cause him as much harm as they did. I think they were just as dumb as I was for believing in ghoulies and thought that he'd fall into the pool and just hurt his butt or something. Now, he spent some time in the hospital, during which I know that there was an investigation into who drained the water and sliced the tank. Now, I was petrified and kept quiet. It's not like I'd done it myself after all, but I did keep dropping hints to my sister and my mom saying, "Hey, remember those kids you told me about, sis? Do you think they could have been involved?" Eventually, people kept telling me to just shush because I was probably only 5 or 6 at the time. Now, I finally admitted the truth to my dad on my wedding night, slightly drunk at the reception, and the fall had caused him to take early retirement from the police force, and he'd gone into local politics instead. Now, at the time of my wedding, he was sitting pretty as the mayor, and he'd done well for himself, and I confessed everything toward the end of the night. I looked from my dad to my sister to my new wife. Sadly, Mom had passed away some years before and never got to celebrate the big day with us, sadly. And Dad began to absolutely roar with laughter, and so did my sister. As it turns out, they'd caught the kids who'd done the crime after a couple of weeks. They'd admitted to everything and been surprisingly remorseful, and also mentioned how a little kid had been there, talking about goblins or ghouls or something. My mom, dad, and sister had put 2 and 2 together and allowed me to live with my secret because in their eyes, all I was really guilty of was not wanting my dad to be grabbed by the ghoulies. The following story was narrated to me by my grandmother about 20 years ago now. We were given a middle school assignment to ask an elderly person to tell us a story and then write it up, and so I hit my grandma up thinking that she'd share some cheerful tale of her youth. And instead, The story she told me was one of the most effed up things I've ever heard. I got a fantastic grade for it though, so thanks for that, Grandma. But anyway, she was just over 70 when she told me the following tale, and she's still around at 90, and she's not quite so communicative these days, but chatty and coherent enough that she gave me permission to send it to my favorite scary stories YouTuber once I explained to her who you are and what you do. And so the following story is written from the perspective of my grandma, Carol, and well, prepare yourself for one of the most screwed up stories I've personally ever heard. My name's Carol. I grew up in a very small town out near Rochester, Minnesota called Plainview. It was a very quiet place right in the middle of a farm country, and back in the 40s, maybe only 1,000 or so people called it home. We'd swim in the creek during summer break and then sled down hills in the winter, but all year round, Sundays were special. Come Sunday, everyone in town went to church, and then afterwards it was home for potluck dinners with neighbors who helped each other when things got tough. Budget running a little thin? People'd pitch in and leave a blank envelope of cash in your mailbox. Barn burned down after a lightning strike? Folks would show up with hammers and food. I remember that. I learned to work hard and love my neighbors, and of all of our neighbors, no one was loved quite as much as Edith Olson. From what I remember of her, she was the kind of woman who could make you feel warm, even on the coldest of winter days. She was graceful, tall and pretty, with light brown hair and a big smile that always carried to her shining blue eyes. She was a God-fearing woman too, and every Sunday you'd see her standing out front of the Lutheran church with an old, near-worn-out Bible that she was oh so very proud of. But life hadn't been easy for Edith. Back in the 30s, when I was still a little kid, Edith's husband Lars had a terrible accident at home. Word has it that he was up on top of the barn fixing roof shingles after a big storm when he suddenly slipped and fell to his death. His sudden passing left her a widow at just 38 years old and with a young daughter to raise too. Little Ruth Olson was still being breastfed when her father died, and when he passed, the whole town descended on Edith's home to help take care of her and the baby, not with the breastfeeding though, I'd imagine. Now, despite her being half an orphan, it seemed like little Ruth had a bright future ahead of her, as a little girl who had a very special place in everyone's heart. But then, when she was just a couple of years old, little Ruth got sick, really sick, and she never quite recovered. Now, by age 5, it was clear that she wouldn't grow up the same as other children and would most likely be confined to a wheelchair. She was also clear that she'd have to live on a cocktail of medications in order to keep her various conditions in check, all of which were down to the illness she suffered within her infancy. God was challenging her in a big way, but Edith never complained. She'd always say, "The Lord provides, and so do good neighbors," and wasn't that just the truth? The wheelchair, the medicines, and all the home modifications Edith needed didn't come cheap, and so to pay for it, Edith put on bake sales down at the church or set up tables outside the hardware store covered in pies and cookies. Now, I've had many a happy memory of walking past Edith's pop-up stalls, but as I came to learn, it wasn't all her work. About 90% of it was baked by other people who happily donated their goods for Edith to profit from. Thanks to her husband's life insurance, she didn't even really need the money either. It was just extra to make sure that little Ruth had the most comfortable life possible. And besides, someone who'd been through that much in their life needed to keep their hands busy, lest the devil make work for them, as the saying goes. For years, Edith was the recipient of endless charity, like in the wintertime when Ruth's medication was paid for by the Christmas quilt raffle down at the town hall, as well as the 50-cent hot dish suppers after church services. And things stayed like that for years and years and years, because Edith, and little Ruthie by extension, they were like the town's talismans. Despite all Edith had been through, she still kept a smile on her face and she still praised God. But as Ruth got older, her condition got worse. I remember there was a time when no one saw her for a while, and then when Ruth re-emerged, she was completely mute and immobile, being pushed around in her chair by her mom. And it was so sad to see because before, Ruth had been able to move her arms and hands to complete simple tasks, and had even been able to get a few words out here and there. People assumed that she was dumb, but she wasn't. She just couldn't express herself very well. But then, by the time she was maybe 13 to 14, Ruth could barely even move her eyes anymore. Edith would push her around the grocery store asking her questions, but getting no answers, and it tore people up inside to see it getting to her. Once again, they rallied to her cause and helped put a smile back on the face of a woman that had so often made themselves smile. But then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse for poor Edith, they somehow did. Now, like I said, Edith was well taken care of by her neighbors, so much so that when a strange man was noticed to be parked outside her house for a few hours, one of them moseyed on over to ask him his business. The man was very rude in response, so rude in fact that Edith's neighbor decided to call the Washita County Sheriff's Department to report him. The sheriff sent out one of his deputies who told the guy to move along before he got himself arrested for loitering or some such offense. The guy made tracks after grumbling something about being an honest citizen, but then a couple of days later, he showed up again, and that time, he was banging on Edith's door. Once again, the sheriff is called, and once again a deputy heads over to tell the guy to move on. It turns out Edith was cowering inside with little Ruthie, who explained that she'd met the man after answering a personals ad for lonely widows. She'd spoken to him on the phone a few times, decided that she didn't want to date, and then tried to break things off. But the man didn't take it well. Not at all. She had him charged with trespassing on the property, and he was warned that if he showed up in town again, he'd spend the night in jail. But apparently that didn't deter Edith's spurned telephone companion. Not even a week after the man had trespassed, he was caught sneaking up Edith's driveway in the middle of the night by a man letting his dog out front to use the bathroom. The cops were called for a third time, but instead of fleeing once he'd been spotted, the man continued his attempt to break into Edith's home. When the deputies arrived, the sheriff himself was with them, and as promised, Edith's ex, if you can even call it that, was immediately taken to jail. I heard he left town the next morning with a black eye and a busted lip, all the result of his uncooperative attitude while in custody. And that was the official story anyway. The unofficial one, as in the truth, circulated much slower. While in custody, the sheriff wanted to know why Edith's ex couldn't take no for an answer, and so he asked him. And when he did, what came out of the stranger's mouth made the sheriff so furious that he beat the living hell out of him, and he had to be dragged away by his deputies. I don't know if anyone but the sheriff heard exactly what was said, but word had it that the man had made a very serious accusation regarding Edith Olson and her daughter Ruth. One so foul and disgusting that not only did he refuse to repeat it, but the sheriff felt the need to defend Edith's honor with such ferocity. Years went by, and as little Ruth blossomed into a young woman, her conditions only got worse. She became completely catatonic, with Ruth having to bathe her, feed her, and change her diapers. And then whenever she needed to get housework done or cook dinner, Edith would sit Ruth in front of the radio and would tune the dial to whichever station was hosting a radio play. Ruth loved radio theater, and I remember loving them myself around that time too. I used to imagine her listening to Lights Out, The Man Called X, or my personal favorite, The Lone Ranger. I used to enjoy the old reruns of Mail Call and The March of Time too, stuff from back when the war was on, but I imagine Ruth got more of a kick out of Little Orphan Annie than old war stories. But on that point, I could not have been more wrong. One day, Edith was out pushing Ruthie around when they stopped by the post office for some reason. I don't know what the heck Edith was doing in there, something money related probably, but as she's standing there doing whatever she's doing, a nearby clerk noticed Ruthie was looking right at him. Herb Cooper was a kindly older man, and so he smiled and waved at Ruthie without expecting anything in return. He knew Ruthie could barely move by then, and so imagine his surprise when he noticed her finger tapping on the arm of her wheelchair. Herb said later that he didn't know if she was doing it on purpose or if it was just a reflex thing, but all the same, she's staring right at him as he's leaning on the counter waiting for a customer. But then, old Herb notices something about the way Ruth was tapping, something that had a strange rhythm about it that was instantly familiar to him. She was tapping out 3 quick taps, 3 long taps, and then 3 quick taps again. And then she'd wait, staring right at him, and then do it all over again. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Herb knew that pattern anywhere because he'd learned it during his time in the military. It was Morse code, the kind that they used to tap out over the wire, and it meant SOS. When Edith wheeled Ruth back out again with a big smile and a cheery goodbye, Herb had to force a fake one. He couldn't quite believe what he'd just seen, even though the evidence of it had been right there in front of him, and when he went home for dinner that night, he told his wife what had happened. It was Mrs. Cooper who told him to search his soul and to go talk to the sheriff if he thought he needed to. Well, Herb did some soul searching all right, because the very next morning he drove to the sheriff's office and told the sheriff himself what he'd seen at the post office. Herb was as reliable as the rising sun, so coming from him, the sheriff knew to take it seriously and went over to Edith's home to have a talk with her. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is when the proverbial cat was let out of the bag. The sheriff figured something was wrong when Edith refused to let him inside and insisted they walk out on the step for everyone to hear. Now, the sheriff told her what he had to say wasn't something that she wanted people to hear, but Edith insisted, and it took the sheriff promising to return with a warrant for her to step aside from the doorway and invite him in. And while once he was inside, the sheriff caught a glimpse of what was really going on in that house. And let me tell you, it wasn't pretty. Despite keeping the outside of her home spotless, the inside was another story entirely. It was filthy, with moldy food in the refrigerator, dying houseplants standing in vases full of stagnant water, and what could only be described as a stack of Ruth's dirty diapers just piled up in the kitchen. I heard Edith tried explaining it away by saying that she hadn't had time to clean in a couple of days, but somehow she managed to keep her own bedroom clean as a whistle while keeping Ruth's like a damned pigsty. He later said it looked like the poor girl's sheets hadn't been washed in years, and how what had once been bright white cotton was tinged in this faded yellow. Edith continued to make excuses as the sheriff toured her horror show of a home, but the final straw was what passed for her medicine cabinet. Edith claimed that Ruth needed all kinds of medications, including blood thinners, kidney regulators, and all kinds of other stuff like that. But upon looking in her medicine cabinet, the sheriff didn't spot anything of the sort. He wasn't a doctor, of course, but he'd confiscated enough pills for enough pillheads over the years to recognize a tranquilizer when he saw one. He knew Ruth needed sleeping pills too, as she sometimes found it difficult to get her rest at night. But Edith must have had 24 bottles of farm animal-grade tranquilizer in there, the kind of stuff that they give to bulls before they go under the knife for whatever reason, along with a ton of anti-anxiety meds and strong pain medication. There wasn't a single medication meant for any of Ruthie's so-called conditions, only stuff to keep her still and placid while her mom pushed her around in a wheelchair. The sheriff had his suspicions right away, and he couldn't arrest her for child abuse right there and then. Instead, he put her in handcuffs for some kind of narcotics violation for owning regulated medications that she didn't have a prescription for. But then once Edith was in custody, he ordered a full investigation into Ruth's treatment, and that's how the cops discovered that Edith's entire life was little more than a lie. She'd been pretending her daughter was sick ever since she was a baby, and then by the time Ruth was old enough to realize she wasn't sick, Edith needed to ensure her continued compliance, and so she started drugging her. She didn't just drug her daughter either. She beat her, starved her, and psychologically tortured her by telling Ruth that everything, and I mean everything, was her fault. Everything from her father's death to her condition was Ruth's fault, and if she ever tried to escape or alert anyone to what her mother was doing, she'd be killed. And this was all discovered after Ruth was placed in foster care and was being taken care of by people who genuinely cared about her. They fed her to get her strength up and helped her through the withdrawals from all the medication that she was no longer being given. And then slowly but surely, as the drugs cycled out of her system, Ruth began talking again, and she told her story in full. It turns out Edith was telling the truth about the telephone companion who tried breaking into her house. She had met with him after responding to a Lonely Hearts ad, one which claimed to specialize in widows. The man himself was a widower, and apparently she and the stranger had shared something of a budding friendship. But then somehow, and for whatever God-forsaken reason, Edith let slip about the way she treated her daughter. She didn't tell her new companion everything. In fact, it was just one little line that aroused his suspicions. And that line involved her taking great pleasure in punishing little Ruthie for what her mother called her sins of the flesh. I guess with him being a religious man, Edith expected her companion to understand. But just like any other sane person, he questioned how a severely disabled young woman could ever deserve such punishments when she was too weak to talk, let alone walk. Apparently, and under the guise of offering Edith some financial assistance, he asked to come over to check out their living conditions. Edith was all for taking the man's money, but when she'd refused to let him anywhere near the house and said that she'd shoot him if he tried, he naturally grew more and more suspicious. He knew Edith lived in Plainview, he just didn't know where. But all it took was a little ride around town, talking to folks about the town's very own angel in human form to figure out where her house was. After that came the sightings of him, and apparently he was only rude to Edith's neighbor because he believed the whole town was in on Ruth's abuse. She talked at length about this big support network she had and how everyone in town loved her and would do anything for her. And so our telephone companion assumed the whole town was bad, hence why he kept on coming back despite warnings from deputies. He ended up telling the sheriff right to his face that Edith Olsen was subjecting her own daughter to a living nightmare of hellish proportions. But like we already covered, the sheriff had been so well fooled by Edith's act that he beat the living crap out of the guy for even suggesting she was bad. I don't know if the sheriff ever got around to apologizing to this guy, but I guess not, as doing so would be an admission that his injuries weren't the result of a bad fall or bumping his head while they were trying to get him into his cell. But I know he apologized to the people of Plainview for not figuring it all out years ago and saving poor little Ruthie a whole world of suffering. Edith ended up going to jail, and for a heck of a long time too. So long I heard that she died in prison back in the 80s. And then aside from being set up with a foster family someplace, I'm not sure what happened to poor Ruthie. I hope she's living a good life somewhere with a good family by her side too. And I hope all the physical and mental wounds have healed, but if they're anything like the psychological wounds suffered by the folks of Plainview, then they took a long, long time to heal. And see, it wasn't just the suspicions that destroyed the social fabric of my hometown, it was the guilt. Folks realized that they didn't really know their neighbors, not in the way that they liked to imagine they did anyway, and that did its own damage. But the guilt, the crushing, inescapable guilt of knowing they'd stood by and done nothing, it destroyed them. People blamed each other, blamed themselves, blamed God for allowing such a nightmare to continue for years and years unabated. And by the time I graduated high school and started looking at colleges to attend, I couldn't wait to get the hell out of town and to some place that didn't have this big, dark cloud hanging over it. I've been back since, and like I said, things finally seem to have changed around town and reverted back to the wholesome, peaceful, and trusting place it used to be. People still tell the story of the evil old witch, Edith Olsen. But to the kids, it's nothing more than a scary story from a different time, something that can't affect them or hurt them. But to folks like me, who are old enough to remember all that evil, hatred, and mistrust, it feels as close as yesterday. I live in a small town in the United Kingdom, and all I can say is that it has hill in the name, and therefore every year the town council do this oh-so-ironic sort of thing of hosting a crappy street carnival that we all jokingly call the Nothing Hill Carnival. Get it? Hilarious, right? Almost as funny as Thanksgiving. In fact, I'd actually prefer that. Well, I'm just being salty because of what happened to me there. I used to have a good laugh there, even if it sucked balls, and was a bit of a laugh with my mates, a good excuse to buy some overpriced handmade tats, look at nice parade floats, all three of them usually, and get a bit tipsy. Now this year, in 2014, I'd recently started dating a new guy, now my husband, James. And he was my boyfriend at the time, but I know I'm going to slip up in the story and call him my husband, so you get the point. Now I went to the carnival with James, and there were some decent cheese stalls this year actually. James is a cheese fan, and I've been known to partake in the devil's milk from time to time too, so we spent far too long sampling different cheeses. And I kid you not, we spent over 80 quid on cheese that day and nearly 20 quid on bread. There's this one local farm that just makes the most insanely good cheese. Now anyway, this isn't important. What is important is that we were lurking around the cheese counter when the parade started. The first entry in the parade was a local marching band, and holy freaking sugar babes did they suck. They were all these old fellas wearing what looked like 1940s marching band gear, and I guess it was some tradition that they do in conjunction with the local museum. But some of these old boys, playing the bugle and the French horn and things like that, and they looked like they were about to drop dead. They tried their best, bless them, but imagine a group of pensioners marching along under the blistering sun, playing marching band instruments. It sounded about as good as you'd expect. And so good, in fact, that I whipped out my phone and started filming them, because damn, this would have made for a good content back then when you were still allowed to make fun of people in a nice way. And I wish I still had the video, but my entire phone got smashed that day for reasons you'll soon find out, and the video hadn't uploaded to iCloud on my local town's then crappy 3G back then, so yeah, lost media, I guess. Now, I was so caught up in filming these old duffers giving it their all that I didn't even notice something my boyfriend had done. He was looking at the procession following behind the marching band, a group of tumbling, cartwheeling clowns. And by tumbling, I mean struggling, and by cartwheeling, I mean some of them could do it, sure, but half of them look more like lads who'd stumbled out of the pub and were accidentally doing acrobatics. Now, one of them was proper good at it. He was kind of a big fella, so I didn't expect him to be as spry on his feet as he was, but he was doing these sort of front flips and all sorts. It was absolutely fascinating. And that's who I thought my boyfriend was pointing to at first when he kept tugging on my elbow and telling me to look. But no, it was another clown that he wanted to check out. This other guy was thin, a lanky lad with a bald cap and green tufts of hair above his ears. Something about his gait seemed familiar, and he came pushing and shoving through the parade of clowns, storming in our direction like someone over here had actually pissed on his VHS tape of killer clowns from outer space or something. And he shoved a trumpet player out of the way, who let out a sort of goodness me and came barreling right for us. And that's when I realized that we were this bozo's intended target. He stormed right up to us in these huge clown shoes with this crappy face paint dripping down his face with sweat, clumping up on his dark facial hair. He accused me of moving on from him pretty quickly. Oh God, no, surely not. But there it was, my ex-boyfriend, Am. Now his definition of moving on from him pretty quickly was certainly an odd one. We'd broken up nearly 2 years ago. James wasn't even the guy that I dated since then. I told him it was a long time ago, and then he got all sad. He said he'd never gotten over me and that I broke his heart. And then he did something even more unexpected. He quoted that freaking Notting Hill scene, that famous one you might remember. Only remember, he was dressed as a clown, and he also didn't get it right. And from the best of my memory, this is what he said. "I'm just a guy, hanging out with a girl, asking if she'll let me love her." I did probably the worst thing I could do. But he dressed like a half-assed clown, and I hadn't even thought about this guy in years. He was a brief college romance from what I recall, and so I kind of just laughed in his face, to which he responded by reaching in his back pocket and producing a jar of a very cloudy liquid and quickly unscrewing it. Now he said something like, if I was going to laugh in his face, then how would I like this in my face instead? And for a second, my mind went somewhere gross. But when he took the lid off the jar, I could sort of smell it. A caustic, burning smell. Now remember that other clown I mentioned? The larger lad who was actually acrobatic and putting on a good performance? He was right by us now. Now James, bless him, hadn't quite worked out what Am was going to do. He moved to tackle him, and I remember saying don't, like I think he's holding acid. And the other clown, whose name that I'd find out later was Len, had already realized something bad was going down, but when he heard this, he came leaping out of the crowd right towards me, and I felt him slam against me just as Am threw the liquid towards me. I suddenly felt a burning sensation on the shoulder of my t-shirt and immediately ripped it off. Only a splash had hit me, and I'll tell you now, thankfully whatever substance Am had cooked up, which we found out he'd stolen from the chemistry lab at the school that he worked as a janitor, wasn't that potent. But it was potent enough that it caused some genuine damage to my bare flesh and particularly my eyes. It didn't hit my face though, it hit Len's. Len, who it turned out was wearing thick homemade grease paint that he swore by in his career as a clown compared to the, in his words, sticky, sicky crap that they sell at circus supply shops. I don't fully understand the science, but I know the makeup he used involved a combination of water-based lubricant and baking soda, and he swore by it for makeup that wouldn't run in the heat. It also meant that the acid, instead of destroying his face, was almost neutralized by the damn grease paint. He did end up with a few small scars, especially around his hairline where the grease paint met the wig. But Len, who is now a lifelong friend, is some kind of genius, I think. He kept his eyes shut, screamed for something to wipe his face with and some water, and he quickly asked me to soak the t-shirt and use that to wipe his face clean, and it really did manage to negate most of the damage Am would have done. Meanwhile, as all of this was going on, James was acting as my hero in another way. Now, I don't want to be one of those wives, but my husband's a bit of a hard nut, especially back then. So he was beating the absolute living crap out of Am, who, let's not forget, was dressed like a rubbish clown. And at one point he had Am down on the ground and was genuinely concerned that he was going to end up getting murder charges for curb stomping this guy. I mean, if someone had tried to acid attack him, I'd probably have done the same thing, but, you know. I yelled at him to stop and dragged him away. And thankfully there were so many bystanders and witnesses, including the local bobbies, that James really didn't risk much. Am was comfortably convinced not to press charges in exchange for a bit of leniency in the charges against him being dropped down to something a little less serious. Now, I'm not sure how I feel about that. The guy tried to permanently scar me for breaking up with him nearly 2 years ago. But hey, you take what you can in the legal system, I guess. Now, he did go to prison, and he's probably out now, but thankfully I have a restraining order against him that my lawyer ensures stays renewed and active. And so to Am, I hope you've become a better person, because to me, you'll always be a steaming pile of crap and an insult to clowns everywhere. People are always quite surprised when I tell them, but I used to be in a band. Not just a pub or garage band either, although I have the utmost respect for working musicians everywhere, but a band that was right on the cusp of being signed. Now, yet right at the moment of truth, something came along and burst our bubble in the most horrifying way imaginable. And long story short, I ended up playing a little acoustic set at this gig during my first year of uni. I got the crowd going with a cover of American Pie, turned it into a bit of a sing-along, and then had a few pints with my guitar case next to me watching the other bands play. One of the groups was a three-piece who covered songs by artists that I liked, things like Zeppelin, Hendrix, a bit of Dylan, stuff like that. And we got chatting after their set, and they invited me to come and jam with them, and the rest was history. And the three-piece became a four-piece. They really needed someone who could do backing, play rhythm, and essentially play second fiddle to their singer and lead guitarist, Richie. Richie could sing like Robert Plant and shred like Jimmy Page, the kind of frontman that every great rock band needs, and so I was only too happy to be the sort of polish that made him shine kind of thing, and shine he did. The bassist and drummer said that I was like the missing fourth piece of the puzzle. Two lads who, funnily enough, were both named Andy. The Andys, as I started calling them, were both great lads and talented musicians in their own right, but they both agreed that I was a great addition, and I loved them for how welcome they made me feel. Anyway, we started gigging together with a new set list, and one that we were really freaking proud of too. And then we started kicking down doors all over Sheffield, Manchester, and Leeds at whatever gigs we could get our names on, and very quickly, we started attracting attention. At one gig, we had an A&R guy ask us for a demo, and then it wasn't long before we got a call back from a bloke inviting us down to none other than Columbia Records. Columbia is a huge label, so as you can imagine, getting an invite from them was as flattering as it was exciting. We went down to London for what was basically an audition, and then after sitting down with some bigwig and the A&R guy that we'd met, we were told to basically go away, write 8 songs of our strongest possible material, and then get ready to record them, tour the country, and then release our debut. It was what you'd call a development deal, something record companies do to make sure that you're all but locked into a contract with them before any others get their greedy little mitts on you. But at the time, we were over the moon, and the future looked very bright indeed. But those next few months, my God, they were exhausting. We kept on going to uni, but no one went home for Easter break, and pretty much all of our free time was spent in our practice space writing songs and trying out said songs at various gigs that we were now being sought out to play. It was honestly one of the happiest and most fun-filled times of my entire life. And thanks to the little stipend Columbia paid us, so we had money to write the album, I had real cash in my pocket for the first time in my life. We all did, and it was fantastic. But burning the candles at both ends, jamming all night and then going to uni the next morning, it started to really take its toll on us, but especially Richie. Richie was the driving force of the band, and without a doubt, and although we were all excited about the development deal, etc., Richie seemed to literally high on the excitement. He didn't sleep for almost 50-something hours over one weekend because every time he tried to doze off, he kept getting ideas for licks or lyrics that he just had to record or write down. He seemed like he was getting into a real state at one point. Like he seemed all frazzled and scatterbrained from the sleep deficit. It didn't help that we were drinking a lot too, but then one day, Richie met this girl who quickly became his girlfriend, and he was suddenly his old self again. Now we were thinking, oh he's probably sleeping like the dead after rolling around all night with her. But we weren't complaining, not when he basically wrote the entire album in 3 weeks, with our contributions of course, and it was fantastic. But then, not long after the album was accepted by our A&R guy and he started looking for a producer for us, Richie started acting all strange. He'd either be super upbeat and positive or ultra moody and negative, like totally bipolar, and the same could be said for his energy levels. He was either raring to go and full of beans or nodding out in his chair like he hadn't slept in days. It was obvious that he was taking drugs of some kind. We just didn't know which ones, as we were actually very naive and innocent for 4 lads on the verge of being rock stars. We never shared anything stronger than a bottle of Jack Daniels before going on stage together, so imagine our surprise when after staging a little intervention on Richie's behalf, we find out that he'd been juggling both a speed habit and a sleeping pill habit, all in pursuit of getting the album written. Now, it was quite an emotional intervention, really, because we knew that he was only doing it for the benefit of the band. It wasn't like he was out there doing coke and sharing needles in the pursuit of hedonism. He was staying up for days writing music while doing speed to keep him awake, and then taking loads of sleeping pills to put himself down so he didn't have a complete mental breakdown. That stopped for a while, surprisingly effectively, in fact. But then one day, it stopped working, and both his body and mind really started to suffer. He'd kept it a secret from us because he knew that we'd put a stop to it, but he was so completely terrified of losing that development deal, there are loads of clauses in them, time frame being one of them, that he turned to better living through chemistry, as it were. And the point is, we had to get him clean and at least partially sober before we went to sign that deal and cut the record, or Columbia would drop us like a live hand grenade. It wasn't easy. We had to cancel gigs, lie to the A&R guy, and delay our next meeting, and then make sure that Richie didn't relapse or lean too heavy on the booze or the weed. It wasn't pretty either. It got really ugly at times, but in the end, Richie emerged clean, sober, and ready to fulfill what I firmly believe was his destiny. We arranged that second meeting down in London, got ready to show off what we'd put together then, and then off we went. Just not as a group. For reasons I can't quite remember now, only me and Andy, the bassist, were getting the train together. Richie was getting a later train with his girlfriend who had to work, while Andy, the drummer, was going to drive down to London early the next morning as he had to give drum lessons and didn't want to cancel. It's also worth noting that Andy, the drummer, had recently broken up with his girlfriend, Laura, and while he was a bit down about it, it in no way looked like it was going to compromise the deal, so no one was worried. Now anyway, me and Andy got to our hotel and then spent all night chatting because we were so excited. We showed up at Columbia bright and early the next morning, and at first, we're the only ones there. This didn't bother me at first, as we'd arrived early like I said, but then as the minutes rolled on and there was no sign of Richie, me and Andy, the bassist, started to worry. Now we're thinking, he wouldn't relapse and mess this whole thing up the night before, would he? And while we wanted to say no, there was this real sense of, actually, we don't know. And that was a pretty horrible feeling, let me tell you. Imagine our whole future falling apart right there before our eyes, but then just as I was starting to really despair, who should show up but Richie? I don't think I'd ever been so relieved or pleased to see him, and we both gave him and his girlfriend big hugs when they got out of the taxi right there in front of us. But then after the hugs and the smiles and the thank God you're here, Richie asked, "Where's Andy?" And it was only then that we realized that no one had spoken to him. It was one of those, I thought you texted him kind of situations, but no one had. No one had called him either, but we still weren't worried at first because Andy the drummer was always Mr. Reliable. And that's half the reason they had him as the drummer in the first place, before I joined the band, I mean, because without a drummer you pretty much got nothing. If your bassist doesn't turn up, you can get by with just a guitar and drums. Look at the white stripes and the black keys. You could even do an instrumental set if your singer doesn't turn up and get the audience to do the singing. And with the rest of the set list, that works surprisingly well. But if your drummer doesn't turn up, you're buggered. And since Andy the drummer always bloody turned up, we had absolute faith that he was going to show up and it was simply running a little bit late. But then, despite all three of us calling him in turn, Andy picked up his phone. In fact, when he gave it a second round of calls just minutes after, someone had switched it off. We waited 5 minutes, and then 15, and then we had to go inside or risk being late for the meeting. We lied to the A&R and company man's face, saying Andy had gotten sick with food poisoning and he was 100% reliable otherwise. Because again, it was still mega important to make good impressions and not make ourselves look unreliable. They ate it up, as the three of us were clearly really excited to be there, but the whole time I've got this heavy, anxious feeling in my chest thinking, where the actual freak is Andy? Everything went fine at the meeting, and we arranged to meet again less than a week later to sign all the actual contracts, at which point Andy really needed to be there. We felt like we dodged a bullet at first, and that it was simply a case of getting hold of Andy before A, finding out what had happened, and B, making sure he wasn't going to pull the same crap the following week when we needed to put pen to paper. So literally, the moment we got back to Sheffield, me and Andy, the bassist, thumbed down a black cab and asked the driver to take us to Andy, the drummer's address. Andy was actually from Sheffield, so he lived with his mom and dad in a nice house near the Steel Bank. And then when we pulled up outside, Andy's car was in the driveway, so we assumed he was home. But when we knocked on the door and his mom answered, I recognized immediately that something was wrong. It was the look on her face, the one that says, I've got bad news to tell you, and since she knew us quite well at that point, she just told us, I think you two best come inside. Now, as we walked through the living room and Andy the drummer's mom asked if we wanted a cup of tea, all I could think was, oh my God, something happened and he's either dead or he's in hospital about to die. And so when she told me he was fine, at least in terms of his health, I felt this sort of premature feeling of relief. But that feeling disappeared entirely when Andy's mom explained that her son had been arrested. The first question out of our mouths was, what for? And looking back on it, I think his mom knew exactly why, and she just didn't have the heart to tell us. I don't blame her. I'd be horrified if my son was arrested on those kinds of charges, but the police always tell you why you're being arrested, don't they? So unless he was home alone when the police called around, there's no way his parents just didn't know why he'd been arrested. But like I said, I understand why she didn't tell us anything, and after we left, we had to kind of wade through the rumor mill before we found out what he'd actually been charged with. My first bet was drugs, because if Richie kept a secret habit, so could Andy. But it was so much worse than that, because Andy had been charged with both possession of indecent images of children and assault on a child under the age of 16. We found out when a news article was shared around Facebook with people either saying dirty nunts or, oh my god, I know this guy. Part of me believed it was all just some horrible mistake, but when Andy disconnected his phone, packed his bags, and just disappeared, we realized it was all true. The next thing we heard is that he'd pled guilty and received a very lengthy prison sentence due to aggravating circumstances. Apparently what he did to the kid that he met online was so bad, the judge gave him the maximum possible sentence. And then after that, it was gone. But so was the band, and so was our future. The record label didn't want anything to do with us after they found out what had happened to Andy, and the whole thing messed with Andy's head so much that he ended up getting mad into the drink for a while before he dropped off the map. Me and Andy the bassist tried putting a band together for a while, but the stink of what Andy the drummer had done was so bad that it followed us wherever we went. And in the end, I just sort of fell out of love with playing live music and jamming with other musicians. I still like playing guitar, it just became much more of a private thing before I swapped the guitar for a weight rack and started on my fitness journey. It became impossible to think about playing music without thinking about playing with my old band, and whenever I thought about playing with my old band, my mind would inevitably turn to what Andy the drummer had done, and more specifically, the kid he'd abused so horribly. I ended up trying to reach out to the victim and their family, but the courts are really strict on identities, so I didn't get the chance to, and maybe that's for the best. I just hope Andy didn't do too much psychological damage and that they've found a degree of happiness in their lives, because they're the reason I'm very careful about my own kids having access to the internet. Ave Imperator, Joel. That means Hail the Emperor in Warhammer 40k speech, and yeah, I know it makes me a massive effing nerd. In my defense, A, my boyfriend told me to write to you, and B, it's relevant to the story. Maybe I'm misremembering, but I'm sure that you said in one of your streams that you're a huge nerd, so I think you'll relate to this. If that actually was one of the other narrators I listened to, then I deeply apologize, and for what it's worth, I think nerds are cool. Now, I'm going to call my boyfriend Hank, which is a bit of an in-joke, and when the story happened, we'd only just started dating. We were in college and I didn't know him all that well, and all I really knew was that he was on the football team, and I kept encountering him when we'd play various pickup basketball games on the college courts in our downtime. We were both decently good at casual basketball, and our first date was actually shooting hoops one-on-one against each other. And then many dates later, let's just say that strip basketball in the middle of the night is a pretty fun partner experience. Now, this came a bit later though. An earlier basketball experience that we shared was when we went to the state fair with some friends. Hank and I had been dating for around 6 weeks by this point, and one of our buds was seeing one of his girlfriends, so there was a lot of social crossover out of the blue. And it felt like we'd finally really found a solid, friendly bunch of people, all of whom were into sports and physical activities and shared interests. I had no idea that Hank had another side to him, a side that I knew nothing about, a side drenched in blood and dust and rivalries that could spill over into our perfect life. The state fair was always awesome. We always went in the evening and when there were fewer kids running around. The glowing neon lights of the rides and attractions just felt so magical, even as a college kid. The state I went to college in wasn't where I'd grown up. I'd been raised in a much more urban location, so this kind of fair was both a novelty and an extremely exciting treat. And this was the first year that I got to experience it with Hank and my new friends, so I thought everything was going to be perfect. It was, at first. We went on a really scary roller coaster, which I loved because I got to squeeze up to Hank. And then we went to the Ferris wheel, which bothered me a little because I thought that it would be an excuse for a little makeout time, but Hank seemed distracted by something or someone in one of the other carts on the Ferris wheel. Now, I asked him what was up and what he was looking at, and he said it didn't matter, just that he could have sworn that he recognized a guy, but there was no way that it could have been him. I didn't press him on it because he seemed so serious, and I was still at that stage where you were kind of courting, I guess, so I wanted to impress him and not just piss him off. And so we met back up with our friends, and next we headed into the Hall of Mirrors. And we all found this hilarious, looking at ourselves all distorted and weird and ugly looking. And again, though, Hank was distracted. I asked him again what was wrong, and this time he looked at me very serious and said that he thought we were being followed. I asked who would be following us, and he just shook his head and said, yeah, it can't be. Now, at this point, I tried to press him on it, but he just laughed and said that he was being a dumbass as usual. I couldn't help noticing, though, that he kept looking over his shoulder in the Hall of Mirrors and turning quickly as if to catch someone following us. Now, the place was pretty busy, so it was hard to tell if there was even anyone with reflections all over the place. And in the end, Hank sort of laughed it off, and I did my best to distract him by pointing out some cool stuff that we could do next. And the next thing was a haunted house attraction that you walk through. I love horror, and I was excited for this one, but I pretended to be terrified by every jump scare and silly face-painted ghouls, so I had an excuse to grab hold of Hank and play up my Scream Queen aspirations. The haunted house was busy too, and there were 6 of us trying to stick together in the cramped corridors. Hank was absolutely insistent that someone was following us again, though, and when a creepy masked actor burst out of a closet, he almost punched him in the face on instinct. I was starting to get a little more nervous, honestly. Who could be stalking Hank that could have him so spooked? After the haunted house, we began walking down Carnival Alley, stopping to play some of the games. Hank won me a little plush fox, which I still have to this day, and we're all having fun going off and playing the different games, many of which were surprisingly easy to win. And then Hank saw him. A guy with spiky, iced blonde bleach hair, wearing a Korn t-shirt, these sort of punk jeans, and weighing probably at least 250 pounds. "It's him," Hank said. I knew it. Now his face had gone almost white. What? Who the hell was this nerdy-looking guy, and why was my jacked boyfriend acting like the devil himself was on his tail? Hank said that he had to tell me something important. He grabbed me and gently pulled me into the alley between 2 of the carnival game tents, and he held my shoulders and looked me in the eyes. His expression was grave, to say the least, and I swear to God it looked like he was about to confess a series of murders. And instead, he said something I could have never predicted. I'm a professional Warhammer 40K player, he said, like at a national tournament level. He stared at me like he expected me to spit in his face or slap him or something. And then I was like, oh, my younger brother would love to talk to you about that. He plays the other one, the fantasy one. I help him paint them sometimes. So wait, what's the panic here exactly? Hank looked equal parts relieved and terrified. Later, he'd admitted to me that he was worried that I'd think that he was a loser and a dweeb if I knew how into Warhammer 40K he was. And okay, yeah, he is really into it. Even when he told me that night, I didn't quite understand the extent of his involvement. All those weekends when he'd said that he was off on some hunting trips or had tournaments or training, most of it was Warhammer tournaments. And so he wasn't lying, but like, the guy was an almost pro-level college football player. I didn't know that he even had the time to play tabletop strategy games. But I found it kind of hot, honestly, and it later made it easier for me to admit to him that I collect American Girl dolls from time to time. We all have weird hobbies, right? But none of this is scary. My boyfriend is a national Warhammer 40K tournament champion isn't the horror twist that I brought to you today. The horror twist was that when he told me that the guy that he'd kept seeing was the guy that he'd beaten in the finals he won over the summer. Finals that took place halfway across the country. An opponent who lived even further away than that. A guy who'd been sending him messages online ever since, acting like a salty little man baby saying that he cheated and his army was OP and he only won because he was attractive. Is that even a thing in Warhammer? and that one day he'd find him in real life and show him what real combat was. Now, I maybe didn't take this quite as seriously as I should have because I'd seen the guy and I knew my boyfriend, and if it came to it, I was pretty sure that my boyfriend could one-punch this fool into oblivion, and so I proposed an idea. Let's make him even more mad, I thought. Hank was hesitant about this because he's a soft baby sweetheart, and I asked him if he was 100% sure that this guy was the Warhammer opponent, and he said yes. Now I led him by the hand out into the carnival alley and saw the guy. He was glowering at our friends standing by the shooting range, and I walked over with Hank and said, loud enough to be heard, "I can't believe you were worried that I'd think that you were a loser for playing Warhammer. Like this chump, for example, looks like he plays. I bet you could take him down in round 1. And then I flashed the Warhammer loser this big grin, and he knew that I knew. It was obvious. His face flushed red, and he pointed at Hank and started screaming about how he'd promised this day would come and reckoning was upon him. I then sarcastically said, "Blood for the god," which I thought was a Warhammer catchphrase, and Hank just gently whispered, It's blood for the blood god, babe." And I just blushed in embarrassment. And that's when that Warhammer loser, angry, spitting with rage, said that if we liked blood so much, then maybe we should experience some blood of our own. He whirls around, grabbed one of the guns from the shooting gallery, aimed it at Hank, and pulled the trigger. Now, the gun made its usual laser bleep-bloop noise, and I saw the mistake dawn on this Warhammer loser's face as he made it. These were not BB guns or air rifles. They were laser target guns, completely light-based, and he just tried to shoot my boyfriend Hank in full view of an entire group of people, including at least 3 cops with what he believed to be a deadly weapon, but was actually a toy gun. That's still a crime, buddy. Now, we were standing by one of those stalls where you grab a baseball and throw it to knock cans down. Now, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed one of the balls and threw it as hard as I could at that Warhammer loser, and it smashed him square in the face. And within seconds, this Warhammer guy was tackled by a local sheriff's deputy who happened to be the brother of one of Hank's best buddies. And so then, to cut a long story short, this is how things turned out. Warhammer loser, real name Elias, had a history of unhinged posting on certain internet forums, obsessing over how his opponent, Hank, had cheated and was going to get even with him. He'd eventually been banned from all but the most fringe communities for toxic behavior. And so basically he traveled across the country after finding out where Hank went to college and took a gamble that he'd find him at the local state fair since it was a popular college kid hangout. From what we could gather, he'd been there on the lookout the entire day. This meant that when he grabbed that toy laser gun, there was clear intent to harm, and had the weapon he'd chosen been an actual weapon, it could easily be legally determined that he would have used it. And this meant that he'd be facing a pretty serious charge simply for pointing a toy laser gun at someone and trying to shoot them. In the end, we did him a solid, especially because I didn't really want his dumbass trying to countersue me for breaking his nose. We agreed with the prosecutor that we drop our own charges against him as long as he was forced to undergo mandatory anger management. Hank also used his connections in the Warhammer scene to ensure that this Elias was banned for life from a number of high-profile national tournaments. It was all very silly and almost comical, but if you think about it, the fact that he traveled across the country and was willing to fire at least a BB gun or an air rifle at my boyfriend in revenge for sucking at Warhammer is actually pretty freaking terrifying. And it's a reminder that there are some absolutely unhinged people out there. On the plus side though, Hank and I bonded even further over his nerdy hobby, and he helped my brother evolve from the fantasy Warhammer to the 40K universe, and now they both help run a local tabletop gaming group. Sometimes I even hang out and I mostly just play Pokemon. Anything else is a bit too violent for me. Way back in the day, when I was still in my early 20s, I used to rent a bedsit in Croydon. Now, for you Americans listening, Croydon is a part of South London, and a bedsit is what we call a studio apartment. Now, basically just a bed, a kitchenette, and an attached bathroom, all in one room. Now, I found it after my mom kicked me out. Now, long story, we have a better relationship now, and I was really grateful to the landlord, a guy called Vic, who basically fast-tracked the whole application process so I could keep a roof over my head. Vic turned out to be a really chilled-out fella. He wasn't the kind of landlord to hold surprise inspections. He always got repairs and maintenance issues sorted as quickly as he could, and he was great about warning other tenants about loud music or late-night get-togethers. And so naturally, I didn't mess about when it came to rent with him. I had it ready, all 400 quid of it, on the first day of every month, and me and Vic always had ourselves a little chat and a catch-up whenever he came over. Now, this went on for nearly 5 years, and although it wasn't strictly the nicest place to live, West Croydon can be a bit rough, I was very happy there. I was able to patch things up with my mom, I had somewhere to take girls, and I had my freedom. And then one day, on the first of the month, Vic didn't show up to collect the rent. I got a bit worried about him because it was the first time in literally 5 years that he hadn't showed up to collect. At least the first time where he hadn't warned me in advance that collection would be late. Now, it wasn't exactly desperate to part with my rent money. I mean, who really is? But I liked Vic, and I was a bit worried about him, so I tried giving him a call. Now, his phone was busy the first time I tried, and then busy the second time, too. And then when I tried about an hour later, I got one of those automated, "This person's phone is switched off" messages. The only thing I could think of at the time was that he'd been taken ill, seriously ill too by the looks of things, and that I'd have to just be patient and wait for him to show up and collect the rent. A few days later, I got a knock on my door from a guy claiming to be Vic's nephew, who's there to collect the rent. Now, right away, I'm very suspicious. I've never seen this guy before in my life, and I still can't get Vic on the phone to confirm whether or not this was his nephew. Now, I ended up telling the lad in the nicest way possible to just F off and not come back till he had proof that he was Vic's nephew. I was definitely in the mentality of this has to be a scam of some variety, but the guy claiming to be the nephew actually seemed to respect my position. And that had me questioning myself a bit, but I still thought that it was best to only hand cash over to Vic. And so I waited and waited, but Vic still didn't show up, and he still didn't return any of my calls. It wasn't until the first of the next month that I started to get worried again. I told myself Vic would be around with an explanation and to collect the 2 months' worth of rent that I owed him, but as you can probably guess, he didn't show up and he didn't call. And I expected another knock from his nephew, but that didn't come either. Now, a whole third month rolled around and I still hadn't paid anyone any rent. And then you guessed it, there was no sign of Vic or his nephew, who I now believe was legitimately his nephew. And then a few days later, I got a knock on the door. I'm expecting it to be Vic or his quote-unquote nephew, but it was neither. It was a woman from the council, and she'd come to serve me an eviction notice. The only clue that she gave me was that she told me the property had been seized by the government, and since it was due to be sold at auction, I obviously had to leave. I asked her what was going on with Vic, but she said that she didn't know. All she knew was that the building was due to be seized to pay for money that he owed. At the time, I assumed Vic had been fiddling with his taxes or something. I paid him all the rent in cash, and so I'd assumed that he wasn't reporting all of his income, probably. And then when I got word about the seizure, I thought his luck had finally run out. But it wasn't taxes he owed, and while I had to wait quite a while to work out what had happened, it wasn't any less shocking for me when I found out. Basically, Vic had the outward appearance of a legitimate landlord, and I suppose to me, he was just that. But as it turns out, Vic had another tenant of sorts, one he didn't tell another living soul about outside of his immediate family. This tenant didn't pay any rent, but technically he didn't make any money either because Vic was using the guy for slave labor. Now, to cut a long story short, a young man had arrived in the UK illegally from Vietnam about 10 years prior. He heard about the flats that Vic was renting, but didn't have any money or papers to be able to move in, and while most landlords wouldn't be interested in entertaining someone like that and might point them in the direction of a homeless shelter, Vic did the opposite. But for reasons that were anything but charitable. As it happens, Vic wanted to get into growing weed in the basement of his house. It turns out a friend of his was involved in the drug trade and told him what a perfect spot his basement would be for growing some ganja. Now, his wife and grown-up son were fine with it, as it meant having loads of extra cash coming in. The only trouble was, none of them knew how to grow it. And so when he asked the Vietnamese fellow what skills he had, and the Viet guy said that he'd worked on a vegetable farm or something back home, Vic saw an opportunity. He enlisted the Vietnamese guy's help in converting his basement into what was basically a one-bedroom flat, with one portion of it dedicated to a living space and the other converted into a small-scale weed farm. Now, the Viet guy stayed in Vic's basement the whole time, and then once all the growing supplies were there, he was offered a job, or rather, a job that very quickly turned out to be no job at all. The Vietnam guy was told that if he stayed in the basement and grew weed for Vic, he'd be able to stay in the country. Vic would keep him safe and secret down there and would pay for all of his meals, etc. without charging any rent. He was free to explore the back garden so long as it was at night, but he obviously couldn't freely go walking about because the police would arrest him and send him back to Vietnam. Or at least, that's what the Vietnamese guy was told. Vic made out like he was doing the guy a favor, and that he'd sort him out with false documents and all that once he'd grown a few grand's worth of puff for him. But then once he'd sold his first crop and realized how much money he could make, he started lying to the Vietnamese guy and basically saying that he couldn't leave. Vic said the immigration people had been sniffing around. They hadn't, and that it wasn't safe for him to come out. He also said the Vietnamese guy owed him money for rent and food and energy bills and all of that, so he couldn't leave till he paid them off. It got to the point Vic would start locking the door to the basement and putting a bookcase in the way so nobody could see it. And so within just a few short months, that Vietnamese fella had gone from a legal immigrant to a modern-day slave. Apparently this went on for literally years, with conditions for the immigrant guy getting worse and worse till one day, he snapped. Vic was in his 50s or 60s, and the Vietnamese guy was in his 20s by the time he escaped, so he easily overpowered him when Vic came down in the basement one day and then said he could either release him or die. And Vic chose not to die. The article I read online said the Vietnamese lad ended up getting picked up by the police for stealing a sandwich from Greg's. And then after he told his story, the police went to check if what he said was true, and that's when they found Vic's little grow operation. He hadn't even bothered to dismantle it, having most likely assumed that the Viet guy was too scared to talk to the police. But he was dead wrong about that, wasn't he? Because this Vietnamese lad was so pissed off that he'd been lied to and mistreated for so long that he sang like a canary once they got him down at the station. I suppose he was looking for revenge for what Vic did to him, and you can bet your arse he got it. Not only did Vic, his wife, and his son go to prison for a mix of drugs and modern slavery offenses, but the Vietnamese guy ended up getting tens of thousands of pounds in compensation, a lot of it generated from the sale of Vic's rental properties. Now, I'm not sure what happened to him after that, if he stayed in the UK or went home with his payout, because I imagine he could live like a king back in Vietnam with the exchange rate being what it is. Either way, I wish him all the best, but for me, the scariest thing is how Vic came across as this nice, laid-back fella, when in reality, he was probably the only person I ever met that I can comfortably describe as evil. So this happened back in the 80s, before health and safety was really quite as severe as it is now. We were just a group of thrill-seeking kids heading to the county fair and excited to ride the most dangerous, unstable, poorly built rides we could find. The more rickety and unsafe it felt, the more we loved it. Weren't a lot of us like that as kids? That was the thrill of the fair, really, wasn't it? The idea that these gruff, greasy men operating the rides genuinely didn't give enough of a crap about you to care whether you lived or died, and that there was every chance that the tilt-a-whirl or bumper cars could go flying off the tracks in some fiery wreck, killing you instantly. I guess that was just part of the fun. Or maybe we were just idiots. We were at a theme park one day, and it had a reputation for being a bit unsafe, and it was in our local area, so of course we hung out there a lot. It was a coastal fun fair and brought in so much money to the town that I'm convinced that brown envelopes changed hands to get safety checks signed off because, let me tell you, there were so many minor injuries and breakdowns in that place. Nothing like the incident that happened to our buddy that day, though. We were strolling down the boardwalk, just taking a break between rides. It was 5 of us, 4 guys and 1 girl, and we were all sort of alternative types. The girl, Layla, had huge permed hair sprayed green. I had a spiky mohawk. You get the picture. People kept away from us, even though we were just really posers, honestly, and wouldn't have hurt a fly. Our one buddy, though, the real thrill seeker, had decided that the real punk move was dressed like a 50s dad with a beige tank top, braces, chinos, and thick-rimmed glasses. It was honestly hilarious. These 4 stereotypical alternatives and this one guy who looked like if he were any more square, he'd be a Tetris piece. The square one, obviously, but it was hilariously ironic. He was the wildest one of us, and while I wouldn't say that he was the leader, he definitely was the linchpin that kept us all together. His idol was Andy Kaufman, and if that gives you any idea as to what kind of guy he was, in fact, hey, let's just call him Tony, as in Tony Clifton, the beloved Andy Kaufman character. Our buddy was always doing that impression, and he'd get a kick out of this. And so we were just wandering around and chilling when Tony stopped us all, acting all covert-like, and ushered us to duck into this little alleyway. I went to ask him what was up, but he put his finger to his lips theatrically and pointed towards this little shed where he could hear 2 carnival workers talking. They were talking about one of the roller coasters, a fairly mid one, not even one that we'd usually bother with. One of them was telling the other one that the safety bars in the second was being a bit screwy, and so to make sure that they told the other guy running the coaster to really slam it into place, or better yet, not use that specific carriage at all. Now Tony looked at the rest of us and just whispered, "We're doing this," and then took off into a sprint, running toward the coaster. We jogged behind him, completely aware of what he had planned without him even having to explain it to us. He was going to ride the coaster without the safety bar down and figured that if he could get there before the employee could warn the current guy on shift, he'd be able to make sure that the bar didn't lock. It had been one of his weird life dreams to ride a roller coaster bareback, as he put it. We got to the coaster, which didn't even have a line because it wasn't that popular, and the rest of us were like, "No way, man, we're not stupid. You do it if you want to," and so we did. We watched from the ground as Tony let the employee push the safety bar down, and then he gave us a wink and a thumbs up and sort of cheekily showed us that the bar wasn't locked in place properly. And the ride took off. We could see that Tony was holding the bar steady, and goddamn him, he was managing it, and he was using one hand to make sure that the bar didn't fly open and the other to hold himself in place against the coaster. It was honestly really impressive. We really thought that he was going to do it. The absolute maniac was going to fulfill his dream of riding that coaster bareback. And then came the incline and the big drop. At the top, Tony leaned down towards us, a speck in the distance, and gave us another thumbs up. I guess he misjudged exactly when the roller coaster was going to shoot downward because he wasn't actually holding on when it did so. And so the roller coaster shot forward to begin its descent, building speed over the arch at the top, and Tony went flying out of that cart and through the air. And I swear it felt like slow motion. Our friend's body catapulting out of the roller coaster and through the air. And I swear I saw a smile on that doofus's face, but that could have just been wishful thinking. Screams were erupting around me as people saw the body flying off that roller coaster, but it all sounded underwater to me. And my eyes just followed my friend as he ragdolled through the air. For a moment, I wondered if maybe he'd land in the sea and be fine, but I could see that he was heading toward the forested area just behind the park. I ran faster than I'd ever run before, and by now, Tony's body had disappeared from sight beyond that tree line. Now, I was the first to reach the scene, and what met my eyes wasn't so much a human body anymore. It was pieces of a body. Like a person had exploded from within. I don't know if this was because he'd hit some trees on the way down or what, but I can only imagine from the amount of damage that it was very quick and he didn't really feel it. I felt it though, deep in my heart and soul, and I've been feeling it ever since. I see that scene in my dreams at least once a month, and yet I somehow know that our goofy, ridiculous friend Tony would absolutely get a kick out of dying by being catapulted off of a roller coaster. Just maybe not 21 years of age. I think he would have liked to live a bit longer than that, honestly. Unsurprisingly, this death was a bit of a step too far for that theme park and was forced to close down. It eventually reopened a few years later under new ownership. Tony's family tried suing the park, but it turns out that the workers who had been talking about the damaged ride had overheard Tony's declarations about riding it. And eventually, under oath, a couple of the group had to admit that Tony knew the ride was faulty, but that he'd intentionally ridden it unsafely. Now, I really don't think that Tony would have wanted that park to get in trouble for his own actions. His family did still get a payout, and the owners dealt with some hefty fines, but I think the alternative would have left them liable for manslaughter, and I know Tony wouldn't have wanted that. He died doing what he loved, riding a roller coaster in the most dangerous way possible, and while I miss him every day, I can't help but hope that he's up there somewhere, laughing his ass off with Andy Kaufman at his own stupidity. I grew up outside of Phoenix, Arizona. We lived rough, played rough, and we were poorer than dirt and had the survival instincts to prove it. Shortly after the events of this story, I joined the Marines, and it was the making of me. I'm a different man now, with lovely kids and even lovelier grandkids. My kids will agree it's fine. And back then, though, we were rough little bastards who thought nothing and no one could knock us off our pedestals. But I suppose we hadn't reckoned on any carnies. Now, I always say, if you ever want to meet men who live harder than you, play rougher than you, and show loyalty to a found family more than you ever will, then you have three options. Join the military, ride with a biker gang, or become a carny. Traveling carnival folk are like nothing else. They will literally kill for each other, and while their code of morals might differ from yours or mine, I respect and understand that. I most certainly did not when the Stanfolk family carnival pitched up in the Poddington's field just outside of our crap-hole little town. We saw the carnival as an excuse to go cause a bit of trouble, maybe pick a pocket or steal a purse or two, show what double-hard bastards we were on some of the rides to impress the chicks. And most importantly, we were absolutely determined to disprove the myth that carnival games were impossible to win. They were rigged, sure, but we were better. We'd clear them out, or so help them God, we'd make sure that they never conned another small town again. Now, this was all before we even went to the carnival, mind you, so we definitely didn't just roll up there that night in my buddy's pickup with the best of attitudes. It was me, two of my male buddies, and then my girlfriend and her friend, who my buddy Pete, the one who owned the truck, was trying to hook up with. Now, don't think that she was too interested, but that didn't stop him from trying. We tried a couple of rides, but mostly we were determined to look good to the girls and win some carny game prizes, so we got hopped up on churros and soda and headed to the games area. Now, the way it worked there was that there was a prize booth where you could exchange tickets for prizes. Each carnival game let you win tickets, and there were big signs saying win 20 tickets here and get 50 tickets there, so it looked like things were doable. Me and my girlfriend wandered over to the prizes tent first, and she set her eyes on this big, fat, plush octopus. She was absolutely in love with the damn thing. This big, green, chubby dude. Big as a St. Bernard. I can remember it perfectly. And it was only 100 tickets. Holy crap, I thought. That was like 2 or 3 major wins on the carnival games. Now first, I headed to the shooting range, where you had to shoot some moving metal ducks with these BB guns, and each downed duck was worth 1 ticket, and if you got 10, then you got a 10-ticket bonus. Firstly, I'm a good shot. I grew up dirt poor and with nothing to do, so shooting cans with an air rifle was an actual genuine pastime of mine. I spent $3 to get 30 shots, which was a decent amount of money back in the 70s, and I managed to down 10 total ducks. I was pretty furious because I'd missed the first 4 or 5 shots due to the gun being incorrectly calibrated, a well-known carnival game trick. Now, I knew this, and it still took me a while to adjust, and eventually, over the next 25 shots, I downed 10 ducks. The game attendant handed me 10 tickets with a wide-eyed look, like I'd somehow broken their all-time record. And then I say, "Hey buddy, I got 10 ducks though, aren't that 20 tickets?" And that's when he pointed out that tiny small print which stated that it had to be 10 ducks in a row and also within an individual clip. So you have to spend $1 and hit every target using the bullets from that dollar. Clearly some absolute BS designed to prevent you from basically ever getting the bonus tickets. Now next was the ring toss, and this was just straight up outright impossible. The rings were too small to fit over the boxes, another famous carny trick, and of course when you accuse them of that, they drop the ring over the box and show that no, it does fit. Yeah, it fits when you're dropping it from above, you person, but it's pretty much impossible to land a single target. The guy even gave me a free ticket for, in his words, sucking worse than anyone else he's ever seen play the game. I knew that he was trying to bait me into spending more or getting violent, but I wasn't having it. Instead, I gathered the boys together and sent them off to try winning these tickets. I could see my girl looking at me like, why am I with this loser? Or at least I felt that way at the time, and I was damn well gonna get those 100 tickets I needed. I had 11, it would be doable. And here's how it went down. My buddy, who was a star baseball pitcher, managed to get a measly 4 tickets from tossing baseballs at cans. The hook-a-duck was even worse, and we got 1 ticket from that. Throwing darts at playing cards, we did well at that, only to be told afterward that the rules stated that you have to hit them in numerical order for them to count. Sure, it was written there, but put it this way, my vision was strong enough that I passed the military entrance exam flawlessly, and there was no way that I could have read that sign. We tried the basketball game for a while, but it was obvious that the hoops were too small for the balls. Why we decided that we could beat the carnies at their own game, I have no idea. And at this point, we had 20 tickets, a fifth of what I needed for that octopus. Now, it was enough for a prize. We could have gotten a little toy Spider-Man or some doll or used the tickets for free rides. But no, I was determined to get my girl that freaking octopus, and I was about to run out of money. I made one last attempt. I persuaded my friend to take my girl elsewhere, and then went crawling to the prize tent and begged them to let me just buy the octopus from them. I had $20 left in my name for my paycheck, and that was meant to last for almost a month, and I offered them the entire $20. He told me that he'd been my age once, and he knew the value of impressing a chick, but his dad, who ran the carnival, would kick his ass if he sold it to me for $100, let alone $20. He was trying to be nice, I know he was, but I was an arrogant little crap, so what I did was turn, point at the Ferris wheel and yell, "Holy crap, that ride's on fire!" And the prize tent guy instinctively turned, just for a second, and I shoved him over, leaped the counter, grabbed the octopus, and then off I was running. I screamed at my friends to follow me, that we had to get back to the truck. They saw me hooning it down the fairway, waving this giant octopus plushie over my head, and they knew crap was about to go down. And suddenly, I stopped in my tracks. This huge guy holding a chain stood in front of me, and I could see this corporate-looking name tag stuck to his leather jacket that read Stan Stanfolk, and I guessed he was the owner. He accused me of trying to take off with his octopus, and I said I wouldn't have this if this carnival games weren't rigged and if they had any honor. And this is how I know carnies do have honor. They just see those of us who play their game as entering into a tacit agreement to be screwed, I guess. I've since talked to other carnies about this, including a couple I met in the service, and I feel like I understand where these guys were coming from a lot more now. I didn't at the time, though. Stan Stanfolk was so incensed at me calling a spade that he told me he and his family were going to chain us up behind their bikes and drag us through our podunk little town until we were begging for our lives. And then chaos broke out behind me. My buddies had taken it upon themselves to start smashing up the rig booths until whatever they could get their hands on, garbage cans, benches, baseball bats from one of the games, all sorts of stuff. Stanfolk and the carnies had no idea who to go after first. As he was momentarily distracted, I shoulder charged him and snatched the chain from him, and then I ran to the offending shooting gallery and slammed the chain down into the counter. All in all, I don't think we did that much damage, but we did enough so that in our minds, we'd caused the carnies who'd been ripping off honest folk a decent hit to their income. And like I say, I see things differently now, and I think it was our own damn fault for willingly playing games that we knew we couldn't win and deciding that we deserved to win anyway. Maybe others will disagree and think that the carnies got what they deserve. All I'm going to add to this is after I joined the military and had a wage, Stan Folks Traveling Carnival received a small, mysterious donation every month from an unknown source. Now back to the story though, me and the buds floored it. I grabbed my girl and practically carried her to the truck, leaping into the back with her and her friend. Pete got into the driver's seat and our other buddy in the passengers, and we kicked dust and flew out of there. We were not home free though. At least 3 or 4 carnies on motorcycles began chasing us and shouting things we couldn't hear, but they were certainly threats, I would think. And the chase felt like it went on for hours, but it couldn't have been that long. And this was where I made my fatal mistake though. Being a cocky a-hole, I semi-stood up in the back of the bed of the truck and waved the plush octopus at them as if to taunt them. And I freaking lost my hold of the thing, and it flew out of my hands and off into the desert. All that effort, and I'd lost the goddamn octopus anyways. Eventually, the carnies clearly gave up, knowing they'd come off worse than us if the law got involved. And unsurprisingly, they did report our act of vandalism, and the next day the traveling fair had mysteriously left town. Me and my buddies tried to backtrack over the route that we'd traveled during the chase, but there was no sign of that freaking octopus. The girl that I'd been trying to impress broke up with me that next day. Needless to say, she was not impressed by someone who flew off the handle and smashed up a carnival just to steal her a toy. And last I heard, she'd married someone in software, I guess. Now, like I said, I'm a very different guy now. I'm ashamed of that night, and I'm sure there's a carny out there, probably the owner's son that I shoved and stole the octopus from, who tells the same event as his own scary story of the night a group of Arizona rednecks smashed up their carnival. And I can't say I'd blame him. All I know is the military set me right, and I avoided any real legal trouble in my idiot youth, and for both of those things, I'm deeply grateful. And for any carnival folk out there or any fellow Marines, Semper Fi, fam. So this happened to my grandma, but she's given me permission to share it with you because I think it's a creepy story people should know. She narrated it to me, so I'm writing her words down, but I wanted to preface this so it makes sense why an 83-year-old woman is sending you a story. I mean, maybe you have a lot of 83-year-old female listeners, but I don't see them in the comments that often, so I assume not. Now anyways, I was a fine young filly in the 1960s. At least that's what the men folk said. So beautiful that I could win prizes, they said. And so I says to them, well, why can't I? Don't we have a state beauty pageant? My folks were against it at first, but as soon as I turned 18, they let me enter. And surprise upon surprise, these men hadn't just been flattering me to get under my petticoats, for which I might add, they would have had to have had my hand in marriage first. I really did have the looks that could win prizes, apparently. I made it to the state finals, and it was an absolute honor, and it was part of the state's grand fair, and this was back in 1967. There were 3 judges, the state governor, the mayor of town in which the finals were being held, and a local businessman who did something with oil. All of these men were perfect gentlemen. I have nothing but nice things to say about how all 3 of these men treated us girls. They made us feel like beauty was something to be proud of, not something tawdry, and honestly, the whole thing was a lot more wholesome and respectful than you hear about in the average beauty pageant. I don't think that I could have seen it through to the state finals if I'd been nothing but a sex object. Now this event is what killed it all for me though, and it was thanks to the most unlikely of sources. There were 5 of us girls, and we were all local winners, so we were all used to the game and all very nice to one another. We were prepping for our first round, which was a catwalk round wearing dresses from a local dressmaker. We were in our drawers when the door burst open and the man stood there. He was a bit on the muscular side, with long hair and I remember a very attractive jawline. He said he was the sheriff's deputy. Us girls, we were all 18, got a bit shy of course and started covering up, and the deputy laughed and told us not to worry. It wasn't anything he hadn't seen before. He had a wife and 2 daughters around our age, and that should have rung alarm bells by itself. Anyway, He said a prowler had been seen in the area, trying to peer in through the dressing room window, which was a tiny little thing 8 feet high, and we'd certainly seen nobody peering in there. And so we uncomfortably put our dresses on while the deputy unashamedly and openly watched us. And over the next 3 months, he was there every time, watching us, undressing us with his eyes while we were forced to actually undress in front of him. And then finally, it's the swimsuit round, and of course, to change for this, we have to get fully naked. Surely the deputy wouldn't be there for that. But he was. One of the more outspoken girls told him that she wasn't comfortable with his presence, and he got a little angry. He whipped out his badge and asked her if she really wanted to risk her place in the competition, or even face obstruction of justice by posing as a problem. Now, of course, none of this really rang true, but we were in a rush for the final round of the competition. And after a quick whisper, what we did was this. One of us changed while the other 4 blocked her from view, and we repeated that 4 times. The deputy was clearly furious about this, but what could he actually do? He had no legal precedent to command us to show him our naked bodies. And so we performed the final stage of the competition. The girl who'd spoken out against the deputy actually won, and I came third, all of which I was thrilled about. And when we went back to change a final time, the deputy was thankfully gone, and we changed back into our regular clothes to mingle with the judges and audience. Now, a couple of us girls met the sheriff and mentioned the deputy being present the whole time, and he got very quiet. We pushed him on what was wrong, and he asked us if we were absolutely sure. Only, it was the deputy's first day, and he hadn't checked in for work. He was due to work security at the pageant, but he had certainly not been authorized to be present in our dressing room, and there had been no reports of a prowler. He asked us to describe the deputy, and we did, and the sheriff went pale and said that didn't sound anything like the new deputy, who was his nephew, a pretty large red-headed guy. Later, they found the deputy. He stumbled in from the wilderness, his ankles and wrists tied together, wearing only a vest and his undergarments. He'd been knocked unconscious, stripped, and had his uniform and firearm stolen. And the firearm was later found discarded in a garbage bin near the hall where the pageant was held. Now, one final twist to the story, and this is the part that I can't be sure about. By 1978, I had a family and a husband, and at this point, a young son. My husband and I were watching an episode of a favorite show of ours when I suddenly pointed at the screen and yelled, "That's him." My husband asked who, and I said that I was sure as shells were shells that one of the contestants on this game show was the fake deputy from the beauty pageant terror. My husband laughed about this, and so did I. Realistically, what chance was there that a guy who knocked out a sheriff's deputy and then faked being him just to creep on women in the 60s was a contestant on the dating game on the 13th of September 1978? And like I said, I can't be sure. But all I'll say is that when I identified him, all I believed I was looking at was a contestant on the dating game, a contestant they introduced as Rodney Alcala. Now, the more I think about it as time goes on, I do think the creep who perved on me just looked like him, but there's still a chance, a terrifying chance, that the fake deputy we met was the dating game killer. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Don't forget to hit that follow button to be alerted of our weekly episodes every Tuesday at 1 p.m. EST. And if you haven't already, check out Let's Read on YouTube, where you can catch all my new video releases every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you in the next episode.